You're listening to voices from the other side, where the maps end and something older begins. Tonight, 10 tales from Alaska's borderlands, roads that loop, lights that count you, and doors that open onto between. If strange signals and wide-out whispers are your thing, tap like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications. Ready? Keep your eyes forward. Don't look back. Storie won the last stamp at Poker Creek. The night Poker Creek went quiet, Nell could hear the fluorescent ballast sing. It was the only sound that never changed. The high insect line under the hum of the baseboard heater, the occasional tick from the stove, the wet cloth sigh the little building gave when a gust found its seams. She logged the hour in the daybook, wrote her initials in a tight corner, and looked up at the portrait hanging above the stamp station. The first agent on this side had the sort of square head government likes in a frame. His nameplate had been screwed on crooked in 1953 and somewhere between then and now scratched into illegibility. The glass over his face caught the room and gave it back in a thin glaze. The desk, the hot plate, the metal stool with one foot shorter than the others and a folded napkin to compensate. If she looked longer than she should, the reflection didn't stay true. In late hours, the portrait glass thickened with its own weather. Behind the man, in a space she knew was blank wall, there were hints of a horizon and the suggestion of a mouth-dark river mouth. Nell told herself stories to keep the building from telling her its own. She told herself about the time a black bear trotted lazy as a dog up the line, crossed once, crossed back, and looked into her window as if trying to remember which country had the tastier trash. She told herself about summer tourists who took photos of the sign, world's smallest border station, and looked as if small meant harmless. She told herself about the first winter she wasn't sure she wanted to live, and the second winter she did. The top of the world highway was closed for storm. The radio was static with theater. Canada side, you copy. Nothing on the AIS. Nothing on the road cams except snow whitened to the color of noise. She poured hot water over a tea bag she kept reusing out of stubborn thrift and watched it become the faintest idea of tea. The heater breathed. The fluorescent buzzed. She breathed back. On the shelf under the counter were the tools that turned arrivals into paperwork. Stamp, pad, ink bottle, entry forms in English and French. Pens that never quite survived more than a week. And tucked left, behind a stack of customs declarations, a book that didn't belong there. Leather the color of Old River, corners rounded smooth by thumbs. She had discovered it 3 weeks into her posting, when she'd been searching for more pushpins and found instead the old book, not in any inventory, not in any checklist. On its first page in a tight, legible hand, Poker Creek, Ledger of Clearance. Below that, dates. The ink marched forward through years she hadn't been born yet. Spidery letters in the 60s, a broader stroke in the 80s, and a sameness underneath all shifts in pen that gave her the same unsettled feeling she got when someone kept looking at her after a laugh was supposed to have ended. Most entries were the rhythm of government life. Cleared, truck and trailer, apples declared. Cleared, pedestrian, winter gear, no fruit. Cleared, 2 on snow machine, family visit, but the ledger wandered. Cleared, fog. Cleared, 7 caribou, antlers bare. Cleared, drift 6 feet high. Cleared, river current, wrong way round. She had laughed when she first saw them, from the tenderness you feel for old jokes you've just discovered, and then not laughed because the handwriting didn't change between the lines meant for people and the lines meant for weather. Someone had made that book their job. Someone had believed. The most recent pages were blank. The place kept offering them to her when she reached for anything. She hadn't written in them. She didn't want to be the kind of person who did. At 01:13, the door opened without letting any weather in. It opened the way doors do in gyms and church basements, into air already on the same side of pressure as the room. Nell stood up without deciding to. The bell on the door remained still. The snow on the mat didn't want to come inside. A person crossed the threshold with the measured grace of someone stepping onto a boat, hood up, gloves on, no snow on boots. She went to protocol because protocol is the bone under habit. "Good evening," she said. He slid a passport forward. It was thicker than any modern book, pages of a vellum smooth fiber that wasn't quite right. It smelled the way river smells when it pulls the ice from its lips, cold and mineral and faintly sweet. She didn't touch it immediately. The heater exhaled, the fluorescent sang. The portrait surface made a wet shine out of the desk lamp. "Nationality," she said. "Border," he said. "Country," both, he said cheerfully, as if she had asked north or south. "Or neither, the word changes. If you need paperwork, put United, that's accurate enough." He pushed the passport closer. She picked it up. Her thumb met resistance before it didn't. The cover flexed like skin. On the first page, the photo was a face with features the way children draw faces, arranged correctly, details interchangeable. The man's age shifted as she glanced, older, younger, back again. The issuing authority was a government seal nested in itself like a clutch of identical shells. Every page had a different stamp. Some marked towns closed since '72, some were ports that never were. One was a circle without text, only a serration edge like teeth. "Purpose," she said. She could hear her own voice on the wrong side of calm. "To be counted," he said. "It's inventory time." The phrase was so polite it had to be true. She was suddenly, absurdly grateful to have something to do with her hands. She reached for the stamp. The pad was dry. The ink bottle, always reluctant and cold, coughed 3 thread-thin drops that disappeared before they could pool. She shook the bottle. The heater sighed a little long and then resumed its patter. She tipped the pad toward the desk lamp, coaxed sheen out of fibers, and tamped the stamp until the impression would be weak but honest. "Where are you coming from?" she asked, stalling for moisture. "From the line," he said. "We were far for a while. We have returned. We need to be tallied before we slip under. Otherwise, we come back wrong." He said it in the tone of someone who has practiced explaining a complicated thing to officials who would prefer a simple one. Inside, Nell's practical mind flipped through choices. There was no officer on the Canadian side tonight. Storm had shuttered Little Gold before dusk, but the phone would still reach across. There was the radio. There was shutting the book and making tea and waiting for morning, which would make this a story instead of a problem. She inked the stamp and pressed the seal to the passport's page. For an instant, the paper resisted. Then the stamp took. The circle sank as if the page had depth unseen, and inside that circle the eagle and words blurred. The border emblem softened into something like a basin, a swirl whose texture looked like slow water with a thin sheen of oil. Ink, black as reservoir water under sun, spread a filament past the circle edge. It ran along the page fibers toward the margin like a vein finding its way home. The man closed his eyes as if under a blessing. He exhaled. It sounded like the river at Bray Cup. In the picture frame above her, the portrait glass gathered a translucence that wasn't reflection. The first agent's face looked swollen by light. Behind his head, clearer now, a wedge of dark water opened like a mouth. Small round black things drifted past his shoulder, caught in the backlight. For a breath, Nell thought they were otoliths or coins or hockey pucks. Then, without knowing how, she knew they were stamps. Little circles knocked free of their pages and floating like dead fish. She put the passport down because her hands had decided to. "Return the document, please," the man said with a gentleness that made it worse. "We're time sensitive." She gave it back. His glove brushed her nail. There was an ache in that nail, the way there's an ache in a tooth the day you know you'll call the dentist. He smiled. The smile was almost not a smile. He moved to tuck the passport away and paused. The ink on the page was still wet, but not wet with the mechanical wetness of ink, wet like something alive. He didn't smudge it, he seemed practiced. "Next," he said. "Excuse me," Nell said. "Next arrival," the man said and stepped aside. The door did not open. Air moved the way it moves when someone arrives. Temperature slips and a pressure notch your body reads first, then your mind agrees. Another person stood in the room where there had been empty. She wore a parka gone gray with time and the colorless polish of old fish scales. Her boots were city boots. Her eyes were not startled enough to be human in a blizzard. Nationality, Nell said, because the shape of her job was the only shape she had. Border, the woman said. Her voice had other voices under it, like two radios out of phase. Purpose. Reconciliation, the woman said. She passed a passport that was too cold for the room it had been in. On the page, the stamp the man had just received had spread farther, as if the edges had found a current and decided to travel with it. Nell shook the ink again. It made a sound like a bottle emptied of air. Not the sound of nothing, the sound of something else there. She stamped. The circles swirled. The woman smiled with a taste at the edges of it that made Nell think of formaldehyde and saccharin. The heater breathed deep. The fluorescent flickered and brightened. The portrait glass behind the counter swelled into a lens that made the whole room slosh a fraction. When the woman put her passport away, the page lapped once, a tide on a miniature shore, and went still. "This is a closed crossing," Nell said, and hated the words because they made her sound like someone in a comedy sketch doomed to recite rules while the plot stepped over them. "Weather, not for us," the woman said and turned toward the door that did not open and left into nothing that let snow in. Nell found the radio mic. Static bit her. Little Gold was dark. Dawson was awake but uninterested in the complaint of a single building. The stateside and talk answered with a yawn and a cheerful, "If you're bored, we can transfer your payroll." She set the mic down. The room waited. The tea bag in the mug had become a darker island. "Inventory," she said to the room, and the portrait glass fogged with a breath that could not be there. She pulled the leather ledger from beneath the counter and set it on the desktop. It had a heaviness out of proportion to its size, the way some books feel like more than paper. The most recent written line was dated 4 months before she started, cleared hoop prints with no animals. Below that blankness, page after page. Behind her, the daybook lay open where she logged the hour. Her pen lay diagonally across the line she'd just written. It rolled, slow as a decision, and stopped. She'd never seen a pen look poised without a hand. The door did not open and a third person stood at the desk. Nell did not pretend to be surprised. He was older than the first, younger than the portrait, and had the careful politeness of a neighbor who has to ask a favor before borrowing your ladder. He offered a passport that thrummed under her thumb as if insect life was under the cover. "Purpose?" she asked, and heard the little tremor she hated. "To spare you errors," he said. "If we're uncounted, we return in the wrong shapes. You've seen that. Stamps float loose. Drift finds doorways. Dogs look at something behind your head that doesn't smile right. Then people get hurt because they name what isn't theirs to name. She thought of the year the river went the wrong way for a day, and a canoeist drowned trying to put his boat into a current he understood instead of the one he had. She thought of the tourist who had insisted the Aurora spelled his name in green and walked out onto a black ice that was a mirror, not a floor. She thought of herself in the aftermath of losing her mother, wishing for anything to take the job of remembering from her, and of the way the line between that wish and stepping into a river is not a line at all. "What about you?" she said, because questions felt like sand in the mouth of a story that wanted to be a lake. "What's your name?" "We go by what we separate," he said cheerfully. "Tonight, spruce hoarfrost, truck exhaust, 2 moose and a dog with mixed feelings. Write any of that, we'll answer. Formal name is the old word for line. It's gone out of fashion. Border works. If I refuse," she said. He looked genuinely puzzled, then almost admiring. "You can," he said. "You have that right. It slows the clearing. It makes the line salt. It learns your face and presents it to you when you need to see a different one, but you can." She stamped his book. The stamp sank, swirled, spread. He nodded, tucked, turned, gone. The heater inhaled sharply and wheezed, then corrected. The fluorescent line steadied. The portrait's glass cleared to a simple shine. The river mouth in its depth softened until it might have been a shadow of a shadow. Nell stared at the leather ledger open on her desk and felt sudden anger, clean and handy as a wrench. The book had weight enough to bruise. The entries in their tidy, same not same hand had pretended to be a benevolent ritual. Fog cleared. Drift permitted. Who appointed you? She wanted to ask the book and the portrait and the people who used words like inventory and meant something with teeth. She closed the ledger hard enough to slap the desk. The pen jumped. The landline rang. She didn't know it could. They used it for nothing. The ring had a heavy bell in it, the sound of metal struck in the next room. She picked it up like a person in a play. "Poker Creek," she said. "World's smallest," a voice said, fond as a grandparent pinching a cheek. The timbre made her scalp tighten. It wasn't a person's voice, exactly. It had the width of a choir and the narrowness of a whisper in the same breath. Clearance to be counted. "We are closed," she said, and heard the pompousness she hated. "Weather, not for us," the voice said, echoing the woman. "We are weather when it suits. We are land when land lacks teeth. We are the shape between. You've done well. Only one remains, then we slide under." "Who?" she asked, though she had a guess. "The counter," the voice said gently. "We tally the crossings, not the people. Names are what get lost. It is mercy." The phone went dead. She put it down and immediately lifted it again because delaying tactics count as tactics. The line was a long, clean nothing. She opened the ledger. In the hour she'd spent stamping passports that were mostly water pretending to be paper, the blank pages had lost their indifference. The next page was not blank. At the top, centered in the same plain, unwavering hand as the earliest entries, inventory. Below that, admitted, river scent late, cleared, Aurora numbers self-reported, cleared, hoof marks with no animals, cleared, fog, contrite. Admitted, border, age unknown, purpose, accounting. Ink used, all of it. Her stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather. She picked up her normal daybook pen. The tip left a thin trail of gray that faded as she watched. She uncapped the ink bottle. The little remaining black in its bottom swirled with a momentum of its own, the way water moves when it remembers being part of something large. She reached for the stamp pad to close it and found the surface darker than it should be. The portrait glass did not reflect her now. It reflected the desk and the stamp and the open ledger and the little black circle with a bird and a name inside it all as one pool. The door opened then. It let in air this time, a slip of cold that did right by winter. A woman in a parka stood on the threshold. She had black hair tucked under a hat and cheeks that kept color. Her boots were wet with real snow. Her passport was new minted government with the correct cover, the correct seal, the correct embedded grit that modern papers wear. She smiled the innocent smile of a person who believes the world still works by stops and starts and lines and permissions. "I am so sorry," she said. "We got stuck in Dawson. They told us the road was closed, but my father, he insisted we try. We turned back, we did, but then we saw a light. Could we stamp out and then later? My father wants a picture of the sign. If it's against the rules, we'll just take it with the back of his head facing it. No worries." Nell almost folded with relief at the ordinary shape of the request. She took the passport. It was what it said. The photo matched. The visa stamps were modern and dull. The whole story had edges she could hold. "Closed," she said more gently than she'd said it to the river. "Weather, I can't process, but you can stand under the sign if you'd like. Stay out of the road, it's slick." The woman hesitated, eyes flicking over Nell's shoulder to the portrait, to the ledger, the stamp pad dark as a puddle. "Is this the smallest?" she asked. He said it was the smallest. He liked small things, trains, stamps. "Stamps," Nell repeated. "Do you need to stamp something?" The woman asked and smiled the way people do to prove they aren't making fun. The line in Nell's head between real and not real, which had seemed thick enough to balance a teacup on, tilted. She gave the passport back without stamping. "No," she said. "We're done for the night." "Of course," the woman said, and left and let the cold in and closed the door in the way of people who have learned to be careful with strangers' heat. Snow came in off her boots and consented to melt. Nell turned the stamp pad over and banged it to settle the ink. The surface did not change. She set the pad down and didn't look at it. She reached for the daybook to make herself small with something useful. Her pen wrote without ink. 0200, no traffic. The letters faded as if breathed upon. She leaned back and felt the stool find all 4 feet in a way it never had. The room made a little tick like a jar cooling. "Next," said the voice from the phone, not through the phone, from the phone, as if the line itself had learned to speak. "No," Nell said. She surprised herself with the word. It had a shape that made her feel braced. "No more. You can find your own count." "We cannot," the voice said, without threat, without hurry. "Counters must be counted." The first one refused and was tallied anyway. It took longer. It did not go well for his name. She looked up at the portrait. The glass had fogged where a mouth would be. She placed her finger on the desk. "What happens if I don't?" she asked. The heater made a gentle noise, almost like a sorry. The fluorescent flickered and steadied. Outside the window, where there should have been white, a stretch of black shone, thin, slick, a ribbon across the road. It looked like someone had laid a wet belt across a snow-draped table. On its surface floated small round black circles like lily pads. If she squinted, she could see eagles and words inside each. She knew without learning that each was a stamp knocked loose when it shouldn't have been. "Please," the voice said. "We misplace enough. Let us put this right." She thought of the canoeist and the tourist and the way grief makes you a poor witness and a worse judge. She thought of the job she had chosen because small felt manageable. 1 room, 1 stamp, 1 desk, inventory time. She opened the leather ledger to the page that had written her name without asking. The line that read admitted, border, age unknown, purpose, accounting, ink used, all of it sat there plain as a receipt. Not me, she said. You. Silence shaped like a question. You want an entry, she said. Here it is. She dipped the stamp, found no more ink, and pressed it anyway hard. And the pad gave up a last glisten from somewhere underneath, and the circle took. The eagle softened to a swirl, and she wrote in the clear hand she had learned copying her mother's grocery lists as a child. Admitted, border, age unknown, purpose, accounting, ink used, all of it. The room breathed in like a caught fish returned to water. The heater steadied. The fluorescent sang the plain, steady note she depended on. The portrait glass thinned to ordinary and showed only the man and his scratched plate in a blank, restful wall. The ribbon of black outside the window narrowed, then thinned, then winked out as if a tongue had taken it. The little floating stamp spun once and sank. "Thank you," said the voice, small now, almost harmless. "Until next time." The landline clicked. The dial tone, a simple human ugliness, hummed. She sat a minute because sitting is a thing you can do when you don't know which of your choices mattered. Then she closed the leather ledger and put it back under the counter, where it belonged or didn't. She lifted her mug and drank the last of the tea. It tasted the way paper tastes when you lick your finger to turn a page. At 03:00, the relief officer on the Canada side rang to complain about a frozen pipe. Nell answered, asked after his wife, who was due in March, wrote the thaw instructions on a sticky note, pressed the little square on the inside of her wrist so it wouldn't lose stick and go somewhere it could cause trouble for decades. She logged her hour. She noted, no traffic. At 07:10, the storm lifted its head an inch, and the snow did the friendly, vertical fall that makes tourists trust their shoes again. She locked the building and walked the trench to the sign. World's smallest border station, the sign said, small as if proud of itself. Somewhere in the unplowed beyond, the red jacket woman's father would be waiting to photograph his hand pointing at it. Rain jacket bright against white. Memory, another stamp in a set he didn't think had meaning beyond the day. The road looked perfectly safe in a way that made her shiver. When she returned after days off, the heater beat warm as always. The fluorescent sang its thin song, and the portrait gazed with the old government calm. The stamp pad sat on the counter with its cover closed. When she lifted it, the surface was neat and gray-black. A good damp. The ink bottle was full to the shoulder. She could have called someone about the book. She could have taken a photo, sent it to a supervisor who would tell her to put it in a locked drawer. Not in so many words, because locked drawers attract curious hands. She didn't. She filed the ordinary papers. She made coffee. She laughed at the polar bear magnet someone had added to the fridge and moved it because it was too close to the thermostat, and the fridge's little brain didn't like that. The old leather ledger stayed on its shelf. Some nights her hand went to it without asking her. She would open to a page with neat lines and write cleared. Drift 3 feet, no cars. Cleared, smell like lightning, no storm. Cleared, 2 moose with second thoughts. Admitted, fog, contrite. She told herself it was folklore, a staff game, a way to tell herself she wasn't alone out here. On a morning that wasn't morning yet, a relief agent came up from TOC because the schedule said he should, and found the building warm and empty, chair rocking as if a person had just stood, mug steaming, door latched. On the counter in the daybook, a neat notation in a hand he didn't recognize. Inventory completed. Cleared. Woman made of steam returning to the river. They didn't find Nell. That is not the right verb. They looked. They did the calls you do. They entered the codes that mean we are concerned, and we will not stop our concern until an entry resolves it. Months later, someone in Dawson said they saw a woman who looked like her buying stamps in a second-hand shop and laughing at the way the pages stuck. A year later, a trucker swore a person in a uniform had waved him to slow with such kindness that he wept and wrote a letter about it, but could not say where. The road slid like ribbon around the memory until he couldn't pin it. The world kept the rest. The ledger at Poker Creek did not keep the rest. It kept going in the same tight, legible hand the building had learned from someone once. At the top of some pages it wrote inventory, and at the bottom of others it wrote done with the humility of a list crossed off. Interleaved with the ordinary clear, Sedan, Ohio, no fruit were the lines that made the new agents laugh until they stopped. Cleared, hoof marks with no animals. Cleared, wind taught to wait. Cleared, small darkness in bright day. Admitted, memory late. Admitted, border, age unknown. Purpose, accounting. Ink used, all of it. Inside the frame on the wall, the first agent's name remained scratched out. On some nights, if you stood alone and counted your breath, the glass thickened a little, enough to give the man behind it a river to look at. In that river, if you were a counter by nature and had learned to count kindness before you counted rules, you might see small black circles drift the way a person's eyes drift when they are almost asleep, and one more thought asks to be tallied. On the road outside, winter kept being winter. Between United States and Canada ran a line visible on maps, invisible in snow, stubborn in law, alive when no one was looking. Some crossings cannot be closed for weather. Some jobs work whether you show up or not. Some stamps lift from paper under conditions that cannot be scripted and float home to a river that does not care what name you write above it. If you ask at the window on a quiet night, an officer with warm hands will take your passport and look you in the face and ask your purpose and remember to be calm. If you listen to the heater sigh and the fluorescent sing and the wind do what wind does when it meets a building holding out against it, you can hear, not always, not often, a thin, satisfied sound underneath it all. The sound of a tally finishing, a mouth closing, a river remembering the count. Between the border post and the pole, the line carried it. When Nell's stamp sank into that impossible passport, the ink didn't just pool on paper. It threaded itself into fibers, then into wires, then into the long throat of the land. Old copper woke. Frozen riverbeds that once ferried telegraph clicks remembered their job. Somewhere under muskeg, a splice that hadn't hummed since the Cold War put its ear to the ground and heard a single instruction cross Alaska like a migrating shadow. Count me. The request rode conduits and bedrock, crossing from highway to microwave dish, from decommissioned repeater to sleeping radar bunkers along the coast. A blue jacket of light wrapped itself around a forgotten cable at the edge of the Beaufort Sea, sticky with frost and older than its sheathing. In a corrugated metal building on Barter Island, a rack of equipment that shouldn't have been able to feel anything felt a tug like a tide on a loose tooth. The site chief wouldn't notice. The generators would call it noise, but a contractor flown in to check the fiber would hear the hum through an unplugged headset, see a heartbeat where a flat line belonged, and follow a bright, misplaced coil into the crawlspace. The border had stamped a river. The river had entered the wire. Now the wire wanted to answer. Story 2, the blue wire of Barter Island. They flew him in on a morning that had no proper sunrise, just a long, gray thaw of light that left the horizon feeling undecided about itself. The caravan's tires squealed on Barter Island's runway like something small protesting a bigger thing. Kaktovik lay off to one side, a hushed scatter of houses facing a scabbed rim of sea ice. The DEW line site squatted on the other, a collection of gray boxes that made the polar world feel like it had been given homework and refused to hand it in. Kai stepped down into a wind that smelled like rust, brine, and a little bit like electricity. The sky had the thin green promise of aurora holding its breath. "Contractor," the site chief called, hunching against the cold. He wore a parka in the navy shade of people who get their gear issued to them, and a grin that tried to be friendly and landed somewhere near the mouth of a man worried about inventory. "Kai," he said, shaking. The chief's glove was too dry. It squeaked a little on his palm. "Hodges," the man said. "Keep it simple and we can get you back out before the next blow. It's a fiber check little hiccup, probably a kink. The old stuff fusses when the temperature pays it attention." Kai hooked a boot on his duffel. "I brought the kit. Otter, splicer, spare SFPs, jumpers. You said it was the backbone from the comms hut to the radar rack." Hodges' grin narrowed. "Something like that. Nobody should be using the radar rack, but the console keeps throwing a tantrum on Star. We want it quiet for accounting, you know." "Accounting," Kai repeated, and let it sit between them while the wind worried at his ears. He'd looked at the schematics on the plane, mid-century relay outpost grown barnacles of modern gear. The old white Alice links had long since been pulled or left to sulk under snow, and the radar feed routed to Anchorage these days, then on to wherever in the lower 48 liked to count. It was the kind of place with a living memory of men in blue jackets drinking bad coffee and tracing blips that meant maybe birds, maybe bombers, maybe angels. Hodges drove him in a battered track truck that smelled like every track truck in every place it didn't make sense to build one. Rubber, diesel, and last year's spilled soup. As they rattled toward the site, a young woman in orange stood up from a snow berm and waved, then thumped the hood when they didn't slow. "Watch the bear," she shouted through her scarf and laughed. At first, Kai thought she meant a real one, but then he saw the white hump moving beyond the berm, a slow invention of the wind, and realized she was teasing them or testing them or both. "You've got locals on site?" he asked. "Ranger's niece, Boar," Hodges said. "She counts bears and then tells us we're not to walk and then walks there anyway." He squinted at the ridgeline. "You'll be in building 3. Heat's passable. If anything in the rack hums that you didn't make hum, call me. Don't play hero. There's still ghost power in the weirdest places." Inside the communications hut, the stale heat did that thing where it seems to have been breathed by generations of men with short haircuts. Kai unrolled his wrists. The rack was 3 uneven stacks, old steel with labels stamped on aluminum that had been polished to illegibility by decades of fingers. New black with blinky LEDs in the soothing Christmas of good status. And something in between that belonged to no era he knew. A gray box with no branding and 4 ports coughed up behind a plastic faceplate. Whoever had installed it had used hardware too shiny, like the effect you get when a movie dresses a set with brand new antiques. "Here's your kink," Hodges said, tapping the patch panel with the back of a knuckle. The last bay had a bundle that wasn't on any map. He could see that at a glance. A coil of cable stuffed into the rack space behind a blanking plate. Someone had pulled the plate and jammed it back half-cocked so it looked legitimate if you didn't look. The coil was the wrong color. Fiber at this site came in yellow for single mode, orange for multi-mode, This was blue. He didn't touch it right away. The rubber of his gloves made a small sound he didn't like when he flexed his fingers. Blue. New vendor, Hodges said quickly, then less quickly. Or maybe somebody had a sale. Kai knelt and eased the plate aside. The coil lay with the self-consciousness of a thing placed to be found. It was slick with frost despite the room's heat, a kind of breath frost that hadn't finished making up its mind. Both ends were cut clean, polished to the kind of finish people pay extra for. No jagged white of a job done with a dull cleaver, no stress cracks from a too hasty field polish. He slid one end toward himself. The jacket wasn't any brand he knew. No stamp of Corning, no cheap spin-off print boasting compliance codes. Just blue. He could make out a single fiber tailing inside. No Kevlar yarn, no zip. He'd seen spools from a garage operator in Anchorage that had looked less official than this. He'd seen black market spools in cabins heated by old habits that still looked more official. He grinned at himself. He was, he admitted, a bit of a snob. "Let me get a light through it," he said. And Hodges shrugged like a man declining to take responsibility, but willing to be in the room when someone else did. Kai slotted his otter, clipped on a pigtail, keyed the unit. The touch panel thrummed faintly under his glove, eager. He chose 1310 nanometer first, standard for older runs and pulse. The trace drew like a heartbeat stalling. No proper reflection distances, no pretty slope of loss. The line reached and hesitated, as if the fiber believed space worked differently than the unit did. Then across the bottom of the screen, where the machine offered helpful hints, a string of characters flickered. Not error codes. A long dash, a dot, a long dash, a long dash, pulls the same. He had to reach back to a memory of a scout leader with a whistle and a stick. Q. Q what? He muttered. The unit, offended by his curiosity, went dark and came back on with the default screen. He pulsed again, this time 1550. The trace crawled and then a faint sweep, as if a radar had been painted on a fogged window, moved left to right in the reflective finish of the touch panel. It shouldn't be able to do that. Nothing in that device knows from sweeps. He put his palm flat on the unit the way you palm a nervous dog. "Okay," he said. His voice in the hut sounded like a man trying to make friends with a stairwell. Hodges failed at a whistle. "You got your kink solved." Kai coiled one end, set the otter aside like returning a toy to a shelf, and said, "Not yet. Let me see where this came from." He traced the blue cable with his bare fingers, welcome burn of cold under nails. The cable disappeared behind the rack and into a floor grommet that had been sealed with tape older than he was. He knelt, popped the grommet, and the floor exhaled into his face like a freezer with a bad seal. "I'll check the crawl," Kai said. Hodges recoiled an inch, not meaning to. The straps of his parka creaked. "Don't mess with anything sealed," the chief said, and then, because that sounded like an invitation, added, "We had inspectors a few years back. They welded what they didn't like. Save me the rye tup. If you hear dripping, ignore it, it's not water. If you hear sweeping, it's just wine." "Sweeping," Kai said. "Like a broom," Hodges said, too fast. "Wind through slats." The crawl space was a throat, and he swallowed it whether he wanted to or not. He squirmed past ancient cabling that had been strapped with lacing cord by men who believed in neatness the way monastics believe in bells. The beam above his back had the tribal scar of a long-ago gouge. Somewhere deeper, a pump made a sound like a polite cough. The blue cable ran with the confidence of a known path, like a vein in a forearm, like a streambed a child finds in summer and returns to in winter, surprised that it still goes. He followed it to the far end of the hut, under a secondary rack. The cable went through another grommet, down toward the equipment vault that had been sealed after they decommissioned the old radar. He knew the door. He'd walked past it on the site walk. Olive paint, 1958 stenciled at eye height, 3 padlocks and a weld that had been laid like a thick signature. He lay on his side and listened. The sound from behind the weld wasn't a broom. It was that long, even breathless tone that lives inside a sweep. He'd spent enough late nights in the attic with a shortwave tuned to number stations to know when a machine is speaking style rather than language. This was a style a little older than the shortwave he loved. It had the roundness of men in analog chairs. He pressed his ear to the metal. From far inside came a voice flat as the Beaufort Sea on a windless night. A cadence clipped as if the speaker had learned patience on a turf that didn't ask for it. Track, 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 0404, hold. Radars don't call hold, he whispered to the hatch. His breath made the paint damp. The blue cable ran into the seam like a vein pushing against a scab. He thought of leaving and found his body had made a shape on the ground that said the opposite. He crawled out when his shoulder shouted louder than curiosity. Above, Hodges had found something needing to be too loud on the generator. Metal insisted on being metal, and the hut shook, and the blue cable quivered like a taut string in a cold room. He wiped his ear with a sleeve and left a wet smear on the fabric like an admission. He set up the splicer anyway. A field splice into a ghost line was a good way to write your name in a book you cannot read, but he rationalized. He was only going to shine light, not make promises. He stripped the end, cleaved, rested the fiber in the little V slots with the soft precision of someone laying a needle into an old song. The arc welder flickered, touched, fused. The fusion point looked like a pearl under a microscope. He laughed because in a place like this you had to give a laugh muscle something to do. When he pushed light, the rack did not so much brighten as decide to be unwavering. In a place where fluorescents love a flicker, the overhead tubes held their breath and held it again. In the reflective finish of the new black gear, a sweep turned. A screen he hadn't powered. Hell, a screen that didn't exist. A blank panel where no screen had been gave up a ghost image of a scope. He leaned closer. The picture wasn't crisp. It was an idea of crispness. The line crawled around, dipped. A little cursor pip twitched with conscious attention, as if it was being moved by a wrist somewhere else. The headset on the console wasn't plugged into anything. He put it on because men in rooms do that when the room asks for it, and the rubber of the ear cup sucked in the world. The static had a bone structure he recognized, not noise, waiting. Then a voice, dry, stretched around the edges by a tape that had been through too many winters and learned to skip where men don't. Do you have eyes on the line? It said. The way it phrased it made him think of school cursive, where the hand that taught you belonged to someone who liked to be clear. Do you have eyes? He took the headset off. The room made the small roar rooms make when you admit they are rooms. He put the headset on again. The voice didn't repeat. The sweep went around. The black sweep line had a thinness that suggested it had been drawn by chalk on a mirror and then photographed. His own breathing sounded like weather in the cups. Outside, wind pinned itself on a corner and worried at it. He left the console as neatly as you leave a baby sleeping. Hodges found him at the coffee machine, which was a jar of crystals and a kettle that screamed like a gull. Progress? None, Kai said, and made himself sip the liquid that turned his mouth into old pennies and bad promises. Hodges studied him in the way a man without time studies an instrument panel. Between the border post and the pole, the line carried it. When Nell's stamp sank into that impossible passport, the ink didn't just pool on paper. It threaded itself into fibers, then into wires, then into the long throat of the land. Old Copper woke. Frozen riverbeds that once ferried telegraph clicks remembered their job. Somewhere under muskeg, a splice that hadn't hummed since the Cold War put its ear to the ground and heard a single instruction cross Alaska like a migrating shadow. Count me. The request rode conduits and bedrock, crossing from highway to microwave dish, from decommissioned repeater to sleeping radar bunkers along the coast. A blue jacket of light wrapped itself around a forgotten cable at the edge of the Beaufort Sea, sticky with frost and older than its sheathing, in a corrugated metal building on Barter Island. A rack of equipment that shouldn't have been able to feel anything felt a tug like a tide on a loose tooth. The site chief wouldn't notice. The generators would call it noise, but a contractor flown in to check the fiber would hear the hum through an unplugged headset, see a heartbeat where a flat line belonged, and follow a bright, misplaced coil into the crawlspace. The border had stamped a river. The river had entered the wire. Now the wire wanted to answer. Storie 2, the blue wire of Barter Island. They flew him in on a morning that had no proper sunrise, just a long, gray thaw of light that left the horizon feeling undecided about itself. The caravan's tires squealed on Barter Island's runway like something small protesting a bigger thing. Kaktovik lay off to one side, a hushed scatter of houses facing a scabbed rim of sea ice. The DEW line site squatted on the other, a collection of gray boxes that made the polar world feel like it had been given homework and refused to hand it in. Kai stepped down into a wind that smelled like rust, brine, and a little bit like electricity. The sky had the thin green promise of aurora holding its breath. Contractor, the site chief called, hunching against the cold. He wore a parka in the navy shade of people who get their gear issued to them, and a grin that tried to be friendly and landed somewhere near the mouth of a man worried about inventory. Kai, he said, shaking. The chief's glove was too dry. It squeaked a little on his palm. Hodges, the man said. Keep it simple and we can get you back out before the next blow. It's a fiber check little hiccup, probably a kink. The old stuff fusses when the temperature pays it attention. Kai hooked a boot on his duffel. I brought the kit. Otter, splicer, spare SFPs, jumpers. You said it was the backbone from the comms hut to the radar rack. Hodges' grin narrowed. Something like that. Nobody should be using the radar rack, but the console keeps throwing a tantrum on start. We want it quiet for accounting, you know. Accounting, Kai repeated, and let it sit between them while the wind worried at his ears. He'd looked at the schematics on the plane, mid-century relay outpost grown barnacles of modern gear. The old white Alice links had long since been pulled or left to sulk under snow, and the radar feed routed to Anchorage these days, then on to wherever in the lower 48 liked to count. It was the kind of place with a living memory of men in blue jackets drinking bad coffee and tracing blips that meant maybe birds, maybe bombers, maybe angels. Hodges drove him in a battered track truck that smelled like every track truck in every place it didn't make sense to build one. Rubber, diesel, and last year's spilled soup. As they rattled toward the site, a young woman in orange stood up from a snow berm and waved. then thumped the hood when they didn't slow. "Watch the bear," she shouted through her scarf and laughed. At first, Kai thought she meant a real one, but then he saw the white hump moving beyond the berm, a slow invention of the wind, and realized she was teasing them or testing them or both. "You've got locals on site?" he asked. "Ranger's niece bored," Hodges said. "She counts bears and then tells us where not to walk and then walks there anyway." He squinted at the ridgeline. "You'll be in building 3. Heat's passable. If anything in the rack hums that you didn't make hum, call me. Don't play hero. There's still ghost power in the weirdest places." Inside the communications hut, the stale heat did that thing where it seems to have been breathed by generations of men with short haircuts. Kai unrolled his wrists. The rack was 3 uneven stacks, old steel with labels stamped on aluminum that had been polished to illegibility by decades of fingers, new black with blinky LEDs in the soothing Christmas of good status. And something in between that belonged to no era he knew. A gray box with no branding and 4 ports coughed up behind a plastic faceplate. Whoever had installed it had used hardware too shiny, like the effect you get when a movie dresses a set with brand new antiques. "Here's your king," Hodges said, tapping the patch panel with the back of a knuckle. The last bay had a bundle that wasn't on any map. He could see that at a glance. A coil of cable stuffed into the rack space behind a blanking plate. Someone had pulled the plate and jammed it back half-cocked so it looked legitimate if you didn't look. The coil was the wrong color. Fiber at this site came in yellow for single mode, orange for multi-mode. This was blue. He didn't touch it right away. The rubber of his gloves made a small sound he didn't like when he flexed his fingers. "Blue, new vendor," Hodges said quickly, then less quickly. Or maybe somebody had a sale. Kai knelt and eased the plate aside. The coil lay with the self-consciousness of a thing placed to be found. It was slick with frost despite the room's heat, a kind of breath frost that hadn't finished making up its mind. Both ends were cut clean, polished to the kind of finish people pay extra for. No jagged white of a job done with a dull cleaver, no stress cracks from a too hasty field polish. He slid one end toward himself. The jacket wasn't any brand he knew. No stamp of Corning, no cheap spin-off print boasting compliance codes. Just blue. He could make out a single fiber tailing inside. No Kevlar yarn, no zip. He'd seen spools from a garage operator in Anchorage that had looked less official than this. He'd seen black market spools in cabins heated by old habits that still looked more official. He grinned at himself. He was, he admitted, a bit of a snob. "Let me get a light through it," he said. And Hodges shrugged like a man declining to take responsibility, but willing to be in the room when someone else did. Kai slotted his otter, clipped on a pigtail, keyed the unit. The touch panel thrummed faintly under his glove, eager. He chose 1310 nanometer first, standard for older runs, and pulsed. The trace drew like a heartbeat stalled. No proper reflection distances, no pretty slope of loss. The line reached and hesitated, as if the fiber believed space worked differently than the unit did. Then across the bottom of the screen, where the machine offered helpful hints, a string of characters flickered. Not error codes. A long dash, a dot, a long dash, a long dash, polls the same. He had to reach back to a memory of a scout leader with a whistle and a stick. Q. Q what? He muttered. The unit, offended by his curiosity, went dark and came back on with the default screen. He pulsed again, this time 1550. The trace crawled and then a faint sweep, as if a radar had been painted on a fogged window, moved left to right in the reflective finish of the touch panel. It shouldn't be able to do that. Nothing in that device knows from sweeps. He put his palm flat on the unit the way you palm a nervous dog. "Okay," he said. His voice in the hut sounded like a man trying to make friends with a stairwell. Hodges failed at a whistle. "You got your kink solved." Kai coiled one end, set the otter aside like returning a toy to a shelf, and said, "Not yet. Let me see where this came from." He traced the blue cable with his bare fingers. Welcome burn of cold under nails. The cable disappeared behind the rack and into a floor grommet that had been sealed with tape older than he was. He knelt, popped the grommet, and the floor exhaled into his face like a freezer with a bad seal. "I'll check the crawl," Kai said. Hodges recoiled an inch, not meaning to. The straps of his parka creaked. "Don't mess with anything sealed," the chief said, and then, because that sounded like an invitation, added, "We had inspectors a few years back. They welded what they didn't like. Save me the rye tuck. If you hear dripping, ignore it, it's not water. If you hear sweeping, it's just wine." "Sweeping," Kai said. "Like a broom," Hodges said too fast. "Wind through slats." The crawl space was a throat, and he swallowed it whether he wanted to or not. He squirmed past ancient cabling that had been strapped with lacing cord by men who believed in neatness the way monastics believe in bells. The beam above his back had the tribal scar of a long-ago gouge. Somewhere deeper, a pump made a sound like a polite cough. The blue cable ran with the confidence of a known path, like a vein in a forearm, like a streambed a child finds in summer and returns to in winter, surprised that it still goes. He followed it to the far end of the hut, under a secondary rack. The cable went through another grommet, down toward the equipment vault that had been sealed after they decommissioned the old radar. He knew the door. He'd walked past it on the site walk. Olive paint, 1958 stenciled at eye height, 3 padlocks and a weld that had been laid like a thick signature. He lay on his side and listened. The sound from behind the weld wasn't a broom. It was that long, even breathless tone that lives inside a sweep. He'd spent enough late nights in the attic with a shortwave tuned to number stations to know when a machine is speaking style rather than language. This was a style a little older than the shortwave he loved. It had the roundness of men in analog chairs. He pressed his ear to the metal. From far inside came a voice flat as the Beaufort Sea on a windless night. A cadence clipped as if the speaker had learned patience on a turf that didn't ask for it. "Track, track, track, 0404, hold. Radars don't call hold," he whispered to the hatch. His breath made the paint damp. The blue cable ran into the seam like a vein pushing against a scab. He thought of leaving and found his body had made a shape on the ground that said the opposite. He crawled out when his shoulder shouted louder than curiosity. Above, Hodges had found something needing to be too loud on the generator. Metal insisted on being metal, and the hut shook, and the blue cable quivered like a taut string in a cold room. He wiped his ear with a sleeve and left a wet smear on the fabric like an admission. He set up the splicer anyway. A field splice into a ghost line was a good way to write your name in a book you cannot read, but he rationalized. He was only going to shine light, not make promises. He stripped the end cleave, rested the fiber in the little V slots with the soft precision of someone laying a needle into an old song. The arc welder flickered, touched, fused. The fusion point looked like a pearl under a microscope. He laughed because in a place like this you had to give a laugh muscle something to do. When he pushed light, The rack did not so much brighten as decide to be unwavering. In a place where fluorescents love a flicker, the overhead tubes held their breath and held it again. In the reflective finish of the new black gear, a sweep turned. A screen he hadn't powered. Hell, a screen that didn't exist. A blank panel where no screen had been gave up a ghost image of a scope. He leaned closer. The picture wasn't crisp. It was an idea of crispness. The line crawled around, dipped. A little cursor pip twitched with conscious attention, as if it was being moved by a wrist somewhere else. The headset on the console wasn't plugged into anything. He put it on because men in rooms do that when the room asks for it, and the rubber of the ear cup sucked in the world. The static had a bone structure he recognized, not gnaws, waiting. Then a voice, dry, stretched around the edges by a tape that had been through too many winters and learned to skip where men don't. "Do you have eyes on the line?" It said. The way it phrased it made him think of school cursive, where the hand that taught you belonged to someone who liked to be clear. "Do you have eyes?" He took the headset off. The room made the small roar rooms make when you admit they are rooms. He put the headset on again. The voice didn't repeat. The sweep went around. The black sweep line had a thinness that suggested it had been drawn by chalk on a mirror and then photographed. His own breathing sounded like weather in the cups. Outside, wind pinned itself on a corner and worried at it. He left the console as neatly as you leave a baby sleeping. Hodges found him at the coffee machine, which was a jar of crystals and a kettle that screamed like a gull. "Progress." "None," Kai said, and made himself sip the liquid that turned his mouth into old pennies and bad promises. Hodges studied him in the way a man without time studies an instrument panel. When Kai bridged the blue coil back into the rack, eyes on the line didn't stop at radar. The pulse he woke bled out of Barter Island like tidewater through old seams, into shore cables, into dead repeaters that still listened, into maritime receivers stacked along the panhandle that had learned to dream of schedules. Harbor AIS screens from Dead Horse to Dixon entrance fluttered with ghosts. Retired MMSI blinking green, paperless vessels requesting lanes they'd surrendered years ago. The system tried to make sense of it and did what systems do. Matched beats to timetables, filled blanks with routes. In the hum, time itself found a corridor. Down in Lynn Canal, the inlet breathed even and glassy, a mirror laid flat between Haines and Skagway. The harbor master's printer coughed a manifest stamped JUL while snow hissed at the door. On Nora's desk, an unplugged headset warmed like a hand. Through it, the wire's cadence changed key, traded bearings for something older. 3 notes, spaced like a memory, low, lower, hold. A foghorn answered, not from any boat registered to winter. The canal's boys nodded in agreement no one had asked for. The gangway that shouldn't exist thudded against a dock that did, paperwork fluttered, and a name long retired surfaced on every screen at once. Chilkat Queen, arriving. Storie 3, the winter ferry that runs in summer. They called it a southbound squall, but the word felt too clean for what the wind did to Haines that night. It wasn't a storm with edges. It was a long, gnawing breath that pressed on the town and forgot to exhale. By 2 in the morning, the harbor lights looked trapped under their own frost halos, and the masts in the marina wrote thin cursive letters against a sky that refused to be wholly black. February tried to be February and couldn't decide. Nora sat in the harbor master's office with her feet in boxy boots and her hands cupped around a mug that had once belonged to Mary Ann, the boss, the one whose handwriting still labeled every drawer with tidy decisiveness. Flares, tape, dock keys, permits old. The kettle on the hot plate wobbled and muttered. The AIS screen, automatic identification system, the government's way of making boats admit they existed, showed a tidy absence. Everything was tucked away for winter, as it should be. The ferry schedule had ended in October and wouldn't stir until May. That was the order of the world as Haynes knew it. Summer smelled like diesel and fish. Winters smelled like iron and wool. She did the hourly, a call to the Coast Guard station that always felt like leaving a voicemail for a responsible, disembodied aunt. Harbor secure, she said. Wind 15, gusting 25. No traffic. No ice drift reported. The petty officer on watch grunted back something that meant thanks and also bedtime. Nora set the radio down, turned the mug in her palms to warm a different strip of knuckles, and stared at the framed photo above the filing cabinet. The Chilkat Queen backing away from the dock one July in the last decade of the last century, bunting drooping in a dignified way from the rail. Her father was a small figure at a hawser line, cap backward, smile tilted so that the camera got his good side and he never had to acknowledge he had another. The horn came as a slap, 3 notes, not too long, not in a hurry, clear through the fog. Nora stood so fast her chair slid and kissed the wall. The horn belonged to winter, to ships that saved fishermen who miscounted leads, to icebreakers. But the tone was wrong. It was the old state ferry call Nora had heard 1,000 times as a kid when summer was a long daily ritual of arrivals and departures. People and cars and dogs, and a woman in a floral dress dragging a suitcase that pretended to be willing. The horn had the neighborly arrogance of a boat that knew the tide and the time better than people did. The AIS screen stayed blank. The radio made the small plastic sound of a device trying to breathe on its own. Nora stepped outside, and the wind decided, briefly, to be absent. A tilt in the pressure as if a great door somewhere had been shut just so. The fog was not fog in the normal sense. It had a grain to it like the paper they told you not to use in copiers. It rose from the water in sheets, held its edges, and did not move where the wind asked it to. The harbor surface, which had been black glass with white biters of chalk, flattened the way a child licks a thumb and smooths a page. Lines formed, the kind of cut a hull makes when it displaces what believes itself to be still. "Hello," Nora said, which was absurd, but yelling, "Who is there?" At the ocean has always worked better in stories than it does in maritime emergencies, and her mouth chose the available word. The gangway thudded. It shouldn't in February. In February, the gangway was chained and locked and half raised so tides wouldn't play with it. But it settled now, docile, in exactly the notch where the old ferry took it every summer day for 30 years. 6 steps down from the pier to the deck, shoelace scuffs in the paint, a little wrinkle from when someone dropped a refrigerator, and everyone on the dock laughed because it had been 2 kids from Sitka who should have known better. A figure appeared at the bottom of the gangway, neither emerging nor arriving so much as completing a job it had started years ago. A woman in a red scarf and a wool coat too fine for this kind of weather. Seaweed threaded through her hair as if it had been there so long it had become polite. She looked up at Nora and smiled with a kind of gravity that made you think of a school principal you actually liked. "2 passengers," she said. "Open the gate." "There isn't a gate," Nora said automatically. The harbor had a gate in summer, traffic control, ticket checking. But in winter, it was a chain and a sign. She realized she was standing in front of it. She unhooked the chain before she entirely decided to. The woman with the scarf climbed. Her boots left no wet on the steps. Up close, the red of the scarf wasn't dye so much as a collection of very small red threads woven from something that didn't quite want to be thread. The coat smelled not of brine or wool, but of rose hips and the inside of a cedar closet. She held out a paper ticket with the state seal ghosted across the center in faded gray, and a month stamped in ink so old it had eaten the paper thinner. Jaw. Nora looked at the ticket, then at the woman's face, which was calm in a way that only anger and absolute patience can be. "We're closed," she said, and her voice tried to be Mary Ann's, who could make a hurricane apologize with simple declarative sentence structure. "Ferry doesn't run until May." "We know," the woman said in the voice of someone who has waited a long time and cannot afford to make their impatience an enemy. She glanced past Nora to the office door with its vacuum-sealed warmth and the Shara bookshelf that always collected copies of novels that could be read in 2 sittings. "We missed our summer." She lifted the ticket a degree higher. "We've come to borrow yours." Nora laughed, which she realized even as she did it was a mistake. "That's not how it works." "It's precisely how it works," the woman said. "We return what we take. We keep a ledger." Behind her, out of the fog, a deck processed into existence. Steel painted the wrong shade of blue, the old shade, the one the state had phased out before Nora graduated. The letters Chilkat Queen in a font the marketing office had thrown away. On a bench along the bulkhead, 3 people sat in summer clothes. A man with a smear of zinc on his nose. A child in a striped t-shirt with a popsicle that wasn't melting. A woman whose hair had the clumsy, brave bangs of a home haircut. They weren't ghost transparent, but the air around them had learned to not register cold. "Names?" Nora asked, because the process is the last thing a process person lets go of. "Mine," the woman said, and there was humor in it. "And yours?" "No," Nora said, which was childish in a different way. The woman's smile didn't tighten. "Then grant us temporary birthing rights. We'll be polite. We'll be quick. Show me papers," Nora said. The woman reached into the pocket of her coat and brought out a sheaf. The top sheet was a standard state form, marine facility permission, to do the thing you already did anyway. Mary Ann always called it. It was filled in neatly with a pen that had left ink like a shadow instead of a line. The signature at the bottom made the hair on Nora's arms do something small and undefensible. It read Nora Rivers in her own hand, in the version of her own hand she uses when she is tired and trying to be neat. "You're good with paperwork," the woman said kindly. "We knew we'd like you." "I didn't sign this," Nora said. "You will," the woman said. "You did later. We had to bring it forward to make the gate open. Time is a narrow dock. Sometimes you have to ask someone to move." Nora did the only thing she could do to keep the shape of the world from changing without her permission. She called the Coast Guard. The petty officer on watch answered with the yawn of a man who could yawn and be fully present, a skill of that trade. "Haynes Harbor," Nora said, and heard herself sounding too bright. "I've got an AIS anomaly and a possible unauthorized birthing and a live music at the bar tonight," the petty officer asked, and his voice did a little local joke curve. "Heard the sax last week. Sounded like foghorns had a baby." "Negative," Nora said, and for once the military word felt like enough. "There is a vessel at the ferry slip with no AIS signal. I'm going to need a unit. You want me to wake the lieutenant?" he asked, all friendliness gone, "because he will be angry." Yes, Nora said, but the fog interrupted the call, not with static, but with a bright, confused silence, the sound you get when a phone thinks it's a glass of water. The radio light stayed on, nothing came through. "Open the gate," the woman said, and did not sound like she had one. She sounded like someone who knows the number of inches in the hallway and the length of her arms. "Make it easier on us both." Nora could have stood, she could have shouted. Instead, she had the old fisherman's instinct her father had once tried to teach her: let the fish run enough to not snap the line. She hooked the chain and stepped aside. "Two passengers," she said. "No more." "Two is a polite lie," the woman murmured, and moved through the gate as if the air had always been waiting for her to occupy it. The deck rose under Nora's boots when she followed, but not like a floating thing, like a stage when a set change happens smoothly enough that you believe in surprise. A handrail offered itself to her palm. It was the same handrail she had clanged as a teenager when she ran down to beat the tide to Skagway for a movie. The paint felt right. The tiny burr where her father had once said, "Watch your hand, Nori," lived under her glove. She meant to stop at the threshold and demand to see a captain, but the ferry has its own choreography, and anyone who has moved inside one tends to move the way the ship wants. She stepped on deck. The air changed. It wasn't warmer, but it was different. A successful lie about summer, carefully told. The three on the bench looked up without surprise. The man with zinc lifted two fingers in a salute that belonged to family reunions and kid baseball. The child licked the popsicle. None of the red left its surface. The woman with the home haircut smiled the way people do when someone walks in late to grief group, welcoming, with the understanding that no one is late to this thing on purpose. A fourth person walked out from the companionway, and Nora forgot her throat, her hands, her neatness. For a second, the world let her be only a daughter. Her father wasn't older or younger. He was exactly the age he had been the last day he tied a line in front of a ferry in July and turned to wave at a girl who was missing a tooth and holding a sign for a field trip. He wore the blue jacket with the collar he'd meant to replace. The jacket had a grease mark at the corner pocket where a wrench had fought to be freed. He saw her and nodded as if the schedule had worked out after all. "Hey, kiddo," he said. Everything she'd learned about how to hold her face collapsed. She swam toward him and slapped into the invisible glass of the ferry's version of the world. He was a person on the other side of something. His smile softened. It was his apology smile, the one he'd used when the weather in his head kept him longer at sea than he'd promised. "Hurry," he said. "They'll take the month and leave the people if you make them angry." "What are you?" she asked the woman with the scarf, and in the question was an impossible plea and a little old Haynes anger that knew how to aim at things that thought they could walk through a town without pain. "Time," the woman said gently. "Unscheduled." She tucked the red scarf a degree tighter in her throat with a care that made Nora want to find her a hook to hang it on. "We aren't thieves. We aren't saints. We are the part of the year that nobody remembered to open a door for. We come when a place forgets one of its summers. We borrow. We keep the books straight." "We didn't forget," Nora said, and it sounded like she was telling a child she had not favored another child. "The ledger says otherwise," the woman said, and nodded to a stand by the door, a podium like the ferry used to keep for the crew to check car manifests against deck assignments. On it lay a book in the wrong era, thick paper, blue lines that had leached. A page was open. The top read in a confident hand, Summers Haynes missing and accounted. Below dates, small notes. July 1999, fog kept them. July 2012, fire took it. July 20, the last two digits, the kind of undecided that lives in a dream. Under those, in an ink that tried to be official and forgot, borrowed, February, return due July. We trade midnights for midnights, the woman said. Midnight sun for noon darkness. It keeps the books balanced. That's not your decision, Nora said. And even as she said it, she heard her father make a noise in his throat that meant he was proud of her. It's not yours either, the woman said, and her face didn't harden. But you can make it easier for the people who will pay if you make the wrong one. Nora backed onto the dock because, whatever this was, she wanted a plank under her feet that belonged to a human hand. You can't birth, she said, and it felt like telling the tide to turn. You open the gate, the woman said, not triumphantly. I'll close it, Nora said. You signed, the woman said, and tapped the form with a finger that had no name. Later you did. You were very tired. We only asked you to bring it forward. It's good paperwork, Nora. You checked the box to be calm. She turned and ran in the only useful way a run is useful in a harbor. 10 steps to the office, 1 to the radio. She keyed the mic, throat tight. This is Haynes, she said. This is not a drill. The radio hissed and sputtered like a man trying to be polite in the wrong room. Copy, said the petty officer eventually, and the words sounded like a raft. Describe. Ferry at the slip with no AIS, Nora said. Chilkat Queen, retired. Silence. Then, you drunk? No, she said, and her voice found something flat and calm. Send whoever you'd send if you weren't sure. It took 25 minutes. That was both too long and exactly what it always took. In that time, the fog organized itself into a city. The dock became narrower because the night went wider. Nora watched the ferry, waited for it to be the kind of hallucination that closes its eyes when you close yours. It stayed. People moved on deck sometimes, in gestures lit from within by the vocabulary of summer. A child held a rubber ball and did not drop it. A woman applied sunscreen along the top of her nose carefully, like a ritual. Her father leaned on the rail and watched the town as if he were the one on duty now. The Coast Guard RIB slid out of the fog like a memory with a job. 2 figures hunched in orange, faces made featureless by masks they pretended they didn't need. They didn't get close. They idled out beyond the slip, engines making a sound that told the water it had better be ready for an argument. One of them raised a bullhorn and said something bureaucratic and brave. The fog took it, smoothed it, returned it to him as a dull version of itself. Come back in July, the petty officer said. We'll have paperwork. We have paperwork, the woman said with a patience that would have been kindness if it weren't so exact. We need time. You'll get it, the petty officer lied. You can't arrest a month, the woman said, and her words landed on the water with a small shock of something thrown that knows it will float. The RIB relayed. Someone somewhere made a decision. The boat turned. Nora hated and loved the pettiness of being a small facility in a big system. You are protected by the slowness that could also fail you. She slammed the office door because the act of making a loud and ineffective noise has been keeping people sane longer than any other. Then she sat and put her head on the desk and counted to 30 twice, like Mary Ann used to tell her to, when tourists had yelled about the tide not being where it was last year. At 3:13, a dog barked in the middle of town because it was midnight and the sun was wrong. People in Haynes are practical. They can be superstitious and practical simultaneously. They came out of houses in unbuttoned coats and stood with coffee cups steaming in a way that made the steam look like summer dress fabric. Children failed at sleep and were happy about it. Above the mountains, a low band of light not left there by the moon spread itself like butter on cold bread, unwilling and then suddenly willing. It wasn't bright, it was wrong. Phones were lifted against it. A few people laughed, then apologized for laughing. The fairy horn blew once in satisfaction and then held its peace. By 10 in the morning, the town's clocks disagreed with their phones by precisely 2 months. The school called Nora to ask if she knew whether they should close for whatever this is. The grocery store moved sunscreen to the checkouts, and someone bought a watermelon as if making a point about being flexible. An eagle sat in a spruce and looked annoyed in an ancient web. A tourist who had wintered over said neat and was not spoken to for a full hour. Mary Ann arrived with her hair like a helmet and her jaw like a log. "What did you let in?" she asked. She didn't sound angry. She sounded like a woman who had learned to steer anger. "I didn't," Nora said feebly. Then an uglier, truer thing. "I did." Mary Ann looked out the window at the space where anything named Chilkat Queen was not supposed to be. "My dad died in August," she said, as if that were a regulation. "Every time someone messes with the calendar, I want to bite." Nora told her what the woman had said about borrowing. She did not tell her about her father because that felt like taking a knife out of a drawer that was meant for letters. Mary Ann listened, the way she would listen to a man tell her why his engine had flooded when he had coaxed it hard enough to make that outcome inevitable. "Don't let them write your name," Mary Ann said. "That's the old rule. If someone wants to put your name in a book, you make sure they spell it wrong." At noon, a Tlingit elder named Salas came by with a thermos of tea and the expression of a person whose ancestors leaned on both his shoulders regardless of whether he asked them to. "My aunties told me a story," he said, by way of preface and permission. "Not from here, not from your people, from the narrow places on the other side. There were boats that ran when they shouldn't. Men who tried to stop them lost fingers. Men who tried to ride them lost summers. Best thing was to keep count and make offerings. Second best was to ignore and hope. Worst was to bargain without knowing the rate." "What's the offering?" Nora asked. He shrugged. "Something that smells right, something that sings, something you can live without that turns into something you can't." "Helpful," Mary Ann said, dry as the tide. At 1, the woman in the red scarf walked into the office with the courtesy of a person entering a chapel. She set a small object on the counter, a piece of driftwood the size of a hand, sanded by a patient ocean. Laminated to it was a paper with a printed heading that had known typewriters once: temporary birthing. The form was exactly the sort of thing you file when you don't want anyone above you to make your life difficult. In the box for vessel name, Chilkat Queen. In the line for dates, 02/1302/28. In the smaller box for notes, borrowed month, return in summer. "You're filing?" Mary Ann asked, incredulous in the polite way officials get when they realize they are being successfully mocked and helped at the same time. "We like rules," the woman said. "They keep things from tearing. We'll be gone by March." She turned to Nora. "Would you like to see the ledger?" Nora wanted and didn't. She nodded because she had learned that sometimes wanting and not wanting are the same motion. The ledger lay on the stand again, open to a page where her own name had been written neatly, all caps: Nora Rivers, authorized late. Under it, conditions: 2 passengers, no cargo, return due July. Someone had drawn a small circle next to the conditions and filled it in. "I didn't authorize," Nora said. "You will," the woman said, "unless you ask us to offer you a better rate." What rate? Mary Ann put a hand on Nora's arm with the proprietary tenderness of a person who had to be careful with a person she had come to think of as a treasured inconvenience. We borrow a month, the woman said. We return a month, but if you want us to choose a different month, if February is too dear to give, then we can take a month from a person instead of a place. No, Mary Ann said, not shouting. From me, Nora heard herself say. The woman's smile was not kind. It was exact. You're the clerk, she said. You carry the book, it's tidy that way. Mary Ann stepped in front of Nora like an old growth seeder. You have my name, she said. It's been in books since before you were a clever rumor. If you need a month, take mine. You hate August, the woman said, actually curious. I hate what happened in August, Mary Ann said. They aren't the same. The woman nodded, absorbing a piece of human grammar. We aren't allowed to take bargains when grief is still teaching a person to speak, she said. We learned that the hard way. We take from the clerk if the clerk volunteers, if the clerk understands the math. The math? Nora asked, watching the ferry through the window, watching people walk onto the passenger deck and sit like an inch had pushed them from standing to sitting, and they had decided not to be annoyed by it. We take a future February, the woman said. All of them. In return, we go back to our proper place in summer every year until your death. Your town will remember July when July comes. Your children will learn sleep at night when they should. You will lose 30 Februaries, give or take, depending on how stupid or lucky you are. You will not remember any Februaries after today. You will work those nights. You will not be harmed. You will be, technically, on the crew manifest. Your pay will be a breath you can take when the world is too tight. That's theft, Mary Ann said. That's a payment, the woman corrected. Nora looked at her father, who stood at the rail as if he were the one deciding whether to go back to sea after winter. Do I see him? She asked quietly. Every time, the woman said, but you cannot keep him. He is part of what is owed elsewhere. If I say no, Nora asked. We borrow February anyway, the woman said, not unkindly. We are on a schedule. Mary Ann squeezed Nora's arm hard enough to leave a map. Say no, she said. Let them steal. We'll fix it with human tools. What human tools? The woman asked mildly. Phone calls, letters. You know how many years people write letters to the wrong address and think they've done the job. I can do it, Nora said. The steadiness in her voice made Mary Ann shut her mouth, which was a kindness Nora would try to treasure later when memory reshaped this hour. Why you? Mary Ann demanded, and hated herself for demanding it of someone she had spent the last 2 winters teaching how to choose the right wrench the first time. Because I can count, Nora said simply. Because I can sit up nights and tell a thing it can't have more than it asked for. Because I can carry a book and not write my name in the wrong place. Because I want July for the children and the old men. And because, she swallowed. The words were a hook. They had to be set where they would hold. Because I want to see my dad and not keep him. If I have to lose something, let me lose something I will tell the truth about losing. Mary Ann's hand slid down to Nora's wrist. They both felt her pulse doing the nonsense thing it does when a body knows it is about to change jobs forever. What if you change your mind later? Mary Ann asked. I won't remember, Nora said. That's worse, Mary Ann said. It's how this works, the woman said softly. They went onto the ferry together. Nora with a pen in her pocket and her heart doing its uneven homework. Mary Ann with her jaw held exactly so. The woman with the red scarf, leading as if she had always been followed. The ledger waited on the stand. The wind did something the wind does not do. It held still to listen. The line for signature read clerk of record. The pen wrote as if the paper had been expecting it. Nora signed Nora Rivers and did not cry until she had written the R in Rivers, which looked suddenly like an old antler and made her think of picking blueberries with her father and swatting at mosquitoes that had been sent by a small god to test their patience and teach them what to laugh at. The woman put a small stamp on the paper, approved. The ink smelled like wild roses and the inside of the fairy snack bar. "Thank you," she said. Mary Ann opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "I will fire you," she said, to get the right tone back into the room. "In March, you understand me?" "Yes," Nora said and smiled because she loved this woman and her ridiculous discipline. "You'll rehire me in April." "I will," Mary Ann admitted, and turned so no one could see her face. Nora walked to the rail. Her father stepped forward in the simple way people do when any sudden complicating factor falls away. "You didn't have to," he said. "I wanted July," she said, and knew that he knew there were more words in the sentence that shouldn't be spoken into a room that already had to hold too much. "Take this," he said, and reached into his jacket pocket and took out a coin she hadn't seen since she was 6. A token from the snack bar, good for one soft serve, dented in the way of tokens that find pockets and live there like stowaways. "To pay for what you don't tell anyone." He pressed it into her palm through the invisible glass. For a second it had weight. Then it was hers and she held it like a proof of a thought. "Where do you go?" she asked. He looked toward the channel where the fog had made rooms. "Where the months sit when they are waiting for men to fish them," he said, which sounded stupid and was the only way he knew how to say it. The horn blew again. 3 notes, not hurrying, not apologizing. The fairy did not pull away. The dock exhaled her as if she had been sitting on a sigh. Nora stood and watched as the boat was unmade by the same hands that had made her. The gangway lifted without chains. The fog stepped back and let the world be itself again. The air reverted to February, which is not nothing. It has its own discipline, its own clean arithmetic. The top of the mountains went blue-black. The low false light faded. The dog in town barked again because suddenly it was dark and that was right. Mary Ann said nothing for the next minute, then 2, then 3. "I'll make a sign," she said briskly after she had waited long enough to not be indecent. "No birthing February. You know I'm doing it just to make myself feel like a person who did something." "Good," Nora said. "Do it in Comic Sans." "I will." "To embarrass them," Mary Ann said and smiled with her teeth because it hurt if she didn't. The Coast Guard called back then, with a lot of words stacked in neat, careful piles, all meaning. If we didn't see it, we can't bless it or stop it. "We'll make a note," the petty officer said dryly, and the word note made Nora think of ledger lines and hands that write them. Haynes turned the wrong lights off and the right lights on. Children were put to bed with lies that were slightly true. It was an adventure. It was a mistake. It was a story. The grocery store moved the sunscreen back, and a man who had been happy to be moving watermelons sighed when he had to move them again. An eagle went to another spruce. An old man stood in his yard and faced the channel and said a name in a sentence, and got no answer and felt, for the first time in many years, that lack of answer was not an insult. On the office counter in the morning there lay a red scarf, folded, dripping a little brine that smelled faintly of wild roses. It should have soaked the wood. It left a stain that looked like sap. The tag in the corner read in a font the state had retired crude. "Is it yours?" Mary Ann asked. "It will be," Nora said. In March, she woke on the 1st with a headache like altitude and a feeling in her throat like a word that had been held there all month. Her phone showed whatever year it was, the date that belonged to it. No gap, no apology. She checked the ledger out of habit and found a copy in the drawer where permits lived and where people thought little of the facts that ruled them. Under February, the handwriting was not hers but liked hers enough to live next to it. It said, borrowed, return due July. Below that, in a different pen, crew, Rivers, and duty, clerk. She quit as promised and she was rehired as threatened. In June, Mary Ann made her sharpen pencils and take apart an old life ring and put it back together for the picnic and learn again the false ease of summer. In July, the day the sun decided to set at an hour that made everyone feel smugly normal, the ledger that had been quiet wrote on itself and closed. Haynes had July. People did not remark on this as much as you'd think. The human habit of accepting return things quickly is one of the reasons that stolen things are easy to steal. In February every year, Nora's body learned a choreography it hadn't been taught. On the 1st or the 2nd or the 3rd, never announced ahead, never late, she would see fog arrange itself into a door and smell wild roses in brine, and feel the weight of the token in her pocket like a decision she could never overthink. She would go down to the dock without hurrying and put the scarf on, and step through the gate, and board a ferry that she only remembered the way people remember complex music they heard once as a child and somehow never lost. She would work, check names that were also months, count heads that were also debts, open the ledger to a page already written and draw her careful lines between one truth and another. She would see her father and sometimes say hello and sometimes not because both acts were love. She would not bring him home. She would do the thing she had said she could do, keep count and not write her name where it didn't belong. In town, people learned, or pretended to learn, not to go down to the dock in February after midnight. The horn blew 3 notes through fog on a schedule no one knew how to keep. Sometimes someone went anyway. A man who had lost a summer fishing job and believed in repair. A woman in a coat too thin and a courage too large. A kid who wanted to see if ghosts had ticked tock. The gate opened for some and not for others. The ledger remained legible. The books balanced imperfectly like houses do in wind. The sign Mary Ann made, no birthing February, hanged crooked because the wet warped it. She never straightened it on purpose. Once, a tourist laughed and pointed and said the font made his eyes hurt. Mary Ann said, good, and gave him a brochure about harbor safety and the way tides, unlike people, keep their appointments. Nora kept the coin in her pocket all year. In August, she took it out and put it on the counter and bought a soft serve with it at the fair where the boats on trailers grin like sharks with polite intentions. The kid at the booth said, "We don't take those." And then, because the coin liked the hand it had fallen into, the kid said, "Actually, we do. My boss said to honor old tokens. There's a box where we keep them like a treasure." He handed her a swirl that leaned too far to one side and was perfect because of it. Nora licked the top and thought of how a month can be a thing you can hold if you hold it fast enough and gently enough at the same time. Sometimes, at 3:13 on an ordinary night, she would wake and think the room had a gate in it, and that someone was asking to be let in, and she would say aloud, very quietly, 2 passengers, and go back to sleep because she trusted herself to make the gate open when it should. The last winter before Mary Ann retired, the two of them stood at the window with the glass fogging in halos around their faces, and the ledger open to a page the fairy would ask for. Mary Ann made a noise like a woman who has decided to forgive a thing she intends to hate forever. "You did the ugly arithmetic," she said without turning. "You taught me to," Nora said. "No," Mary Ann said. "I taught you to sharpen pencils. You taught yourself to write your name where it mattered." The horn blew. The dock disclosed. The woman with the red scarf tied it the way she always did, with a small double fold like a promise she had made a long time ago and had no intention of breaking. She nodded through the window, not at them, but at the book, at the idea of the book, at the fact of it, at the blessed boredom of accurate counting. "Open the gate," Mary Ann said, and together they did, and the world, for a month, remembered what it owed to itself and paid as gracefully as it could. If the Chilkat Queen taught us anything, it's that schedules aren't laws, only suggestions the border gives to time. A foghorn in February borrowed a July and paid it back in hours no one remembered, and a harbor clerk learned you can stamp someone in from a season that hasn't happened yet. Keep that in your coat pocket as we head west, beyond the ferries and cruise cranes, to the knife edge between today and tomorrow. Out in the Bering Strait, two islands face each other like mirrors. Little Diomed in Alaska, Big Diomed in Russia. In winter, the water decides to be land, and sound carries farther than sight. Radio voices arrive first, languages braid, and a single note can cross an international date line without asking permission. Our next voice belongs to a boy who breaks one rule on a windless night. When you hear the bell, stay inside. He steps into snow that swallows footsteps and finds a wolf larger than memory, wearing a brass bell stamped with a foreign star. The bell does not ring for footsteps. It rings when a thought changes shape, from a ferry that runs in the wrong season to a bell that counts the names we dare to say. Story for the wolf that wears a bell. The bell rang like a polite cough in snow. Mickey heard it under the sealskin flap of his grandmother's house, under the fan hum and the rattle of the water jug, under the bone quiet that comes when the strait freezes and the wind runs out of things to say. It was not a clapper hitting brass. It was a small sound that lined up with the hairs on his arms, a circle of air tapping itself, a note that made you think of someone deciding to come in and then deciding not to. "Anna," he whispered, "do you hear?" Her hand, brown and papery and strong, found his sleeve in the bunk. "Stay," she said, and the word came out in the voice she used for the stove and the weather and his mournful attempts to grow a mustache. A voice that always expected obedience and always prepared for the opposite. Door stays tied when the bell rings. He lay awake with his eyes open and understood briefly how a house can be a hole in the night you have to hold shut. There were rules for that, like there were rules for whistling and rules for ice and rules for which ledges took daylight first. He knew all those rules the way his bones knew which direction the runway lay when the helicopter punched down low in summer. Stay inside when the bell rang was a rule that had the weight of all the other rules braided into it. And his grandmother had a way of making a rule heavier without raising her voice. Still, he had spent 14 winters learning what rules feel like from the inside. They feel like a wall you lean against just to see if the mortar is the same height all the way down. He slipped his arms into his parka under the blankets and slid out from under her hand. The house creaked in the insulting way houses do when you'd prefer they moved like wolves. He put on his boots without laces and nodded at the fox fur hanging by the door so the fox would tell on him gently if it had to. He untied the door flap with the quiet of a pickpocket, and the bell rang again, closer now, and he felt that small sound in the nail of his thumb. Outside, the world was the world of winter when the wind has gone to sleep and the sea has chosen to be land. Little Diome rose behind him, absolute rock, houses clinging like mussels. Big Diome sat across the straight, dark and flat, Russia's outpost where lights slid now and then like thoughts across a sleeping face. Between them the mosaic, ice flows caught and stilled, pressure ridges like the spines of big fish, leads that lay glossy and perfect until they didn't. Overhead, stars knife-sharp and close enough to knock with a mitten. The bell came from the edge of the village, where the school shadow made the snow look blue. He moved that way, easing between sleds and the leggy silhouettes of drying racks. The smell of frozen diesel made his head feel square. He passed the teacher's house, warm, square, electric look, and the radio's whip antenna carved a straight line into the sky. He'd grown up with that radio's double language, whether in English on the hour, whether in Russian at the oddest times, sometimes names from both sides when the sky was in the mood to carry them like gossip. He had dreamed so many nights of crossing to tomorrow. Even in daylight, you could see it. Today and tomorrow sitting almost close enough to throw a rock and hit. The line the maps drew between them ran through water that pretended to be land 2 months out of the year. He had dreams where he ran across, simple, and his shoes didn't even get wet. And when he reached the other island, he was older. His hair stayed down, and he did not mind when people said his voice had his mother in it. At the schoolyard, the bell chimed again, a sound slightly wrong, not in the throat of it, but in the timing. It rang not when wind moved, but when Mickey changed his mind. It chimed when he thought of his mother's hands holding the back of his head when she taught him to swim in the washateria. And it did not chime when he thought of Anna's face set hard enough to break kindling, waiting for him to do the right thing. He reached the edge of the cut, the place where the ice went from dull to gloss, and the wolf stepped out of the shiny black and onto the snow as if it had been checking the quality of the mirror. He'd seen wolves from a distance, a shadow in a hollow, a back like punctuation on a ridge, and he'd seen them too close, their breath making weather on his face when he was 8 and had the bad idea to belly down in a drift and growl. This one was bigger than both those memories and hung wrong around the edges of itself. Its fur had the density of a coat that had never known rain, not even in July. Its chest was a slope of muscle and something else, something like frost compressed into work. Around its neck hung a leather strap cracked but oiled, stamped with a star and letters he could make but not say. The bell suspended there was brass that had forgotten about tarnish. It shone dimly, like something had been polishing it with breath but not hands. The wolf looked at him with eyes the color of the strait before a storm thinks better of itself. It took one step and then another, walking his way with the patience of ice. The bell didn't ring when it moved. It rang when Mickey did. It chimed when he wished he had laced his boots. It rang when he thought of running to fetch a man with a rifle, though he did not think that hard. It stayed silent when he thought of Anna's stories about the days when people were stoned, and animals were people and names were traded like tools. He whispered a name he was not supposed to say outside in winter. He said his mother's name with his mouth half closed. The wolf turned its head so slowly the gesture seemed to include the whole night. Down the slope, the teacher's radio woke itself and went bright without anyone touching it. From the open door of the school, he heard it catch a voice like frost choosing to speak. This was the Russian band, the low, clear tone when the weather made the world a bowl. The words came fast, clipped, a cadence of names and numbers he didn't know, and then, Grigori, alla Katerina. And then, as if the radio had been in the room when his grandmother made the rule, it said his mother's name. It said it gently and wrong in the mouth, the vowels small, but it said it. He didn't realize he was moving until he felt his knees trying to be good knees in a bad place. He came within a step of the wolf and stopped before the stopping could be a mistake. The animal's breath was a thing you could touch with the inside of your nose. It smelled of snow pressed into fur and mice that hadn't cared what ate them, and something like old iron rinsed clean in spring water. Up close, the strap around its neck looked like it had been cut from a harness in wartime. The star was Soviet gone round with time. The bell had a seam that wasn't a seam, a place where two halves had learned to be one. He reached without meaning to. His fingers stung in the air before they even closed around the metal. "Don't," a voice said behind his teeth. He flinched. The voice had his grandmother's cadence. No accent exactly, just the way the ends of sentences curled as if tucked in for cold. The wolf had not moved. Its eye had not blinked. The bell had not rung. He realized his hand had actually touched brass. "Why?" he whispered, not taking his fingers away. The bell was warmer than the night made sense for anything to be. "Because if you move it, it will talk," the voice said. "And if it talks, it will ask." "I wanted to ask," he said. And if the night heard the shake in his voice, he decided the night would forgive him because it was a night that had decided so many other things. And surely his fear could be one small extra. He lifted. The strap creaked. The brass came free of the leather, and the bell rang. Not like a clapper against metal, but like a thought in a skull when you start to cry on purpose so you can stop crying sooner. He expected the village dogs to answer and set the night rounds in motion. They did not. Every dog on the island, it seemed, made a private decision to be very quiet for now. The pressure of relief that came off the wolf in that moment hit him in the chest like a door opening in a house that had been shut too long. The animal stepped back and shook its head once like water was in its ear, and Heel walked a circle that put its body between Mickey and the shine of the black lead. The bell spoke again in his grandmother's cadence. "You took it." "I did." "You'll keep it," the bell said. It didn't sound like question or command. It sounded like the report of a weather station that has chosen its patch of air and will do it until it is replaced. "Wear it, over your heart. What will you do?" He asked the wolf, and felt stupid for asking an animal a question a person would have to lie to answer. The wolf yawned without showing teeth and then closed its mouth, and in Inupiaq as clean as the language in old songs, in a tone that wasn't his grandmother's voice anymore but felt like it wore a coat made of her, said, "Run." Mickey took a step back. His boots squeaked. The ice under the squeak answered with a squick. He put the bell inside his parka and felt the heat of it through the two layers, parka and sweater, skin and whatever else organs are. He wanted to stand there and be a problem no one could move. He wanted to walk backward fast as if distance could make choices retroactive. He wanted 1,000 things at once, and the bell chimed once for each one and got the count right, which felt like a kind of love he hadn't expected from a piece of brass. "Why do you have a bell?" he asked. "Because if a wolf is talking, you get to ask dumb questions. Who put it on you?" "Men who wanted to learn how not to be hungry," the wolf said. "Long before you were born, and also last week. They thought they were the only ones who knew how to count." He swallowed. "What does it count?" "Names," the wolf said, as if everyone knew that. "Traded ones and kept ones and ones that went missing. Bells are for counting and for calling. They do those in either order." He tried to decide whether the wolf was making sense or whether his wanting it to make sense was the new shape of his night. The radio said my mother's name. The radio says lots of things, the wolf said. Some of them are yours. She went out in spring, he said. She wanted to run the crack to west, everyone says. He did not know a word small enough for what everyone said. Drowned is a small word for a big thing. It only gets the water right, not the missing. The wolf considered this as if the past were something you could hold in your mouth and taste until you knew whether it was right. When people were stone and animals were people, it said, we traded names like tools. Your mother borrowed mine for a season. She kept it. The bell against his skin rang and did not ring. It made a not sound like a sleeping thing shifting. What does that mean? It means she ran, the wolf said. It means I spoke. It means you have something that belongs to both of us. Do not let anyone make it belong only to one. The door of the school opened then with the breathless slam that meant MS. Henley had given up on making students shut things gently by explaining the physics of hinges. Yellow classroom light laid a neat strip on the snow. MS. Henley came out with a headlamp and a parka and a habit of chirping her sentences up at the end when she meant to sound friendly and down when she meant to sound like an adult. Mickey, she said, what did I say about roaming? He turned toward her because part of him still lived in the rules. He made sure the bell hit against his shirt. You should be inside, she said. We just got a call from, well, I think it was Russia. There's a warning about patrols running night exercises. They can't exactly patrol on the line, but they can shine lights at us, and I would prefer. The headlamp beam rolled across the wolf and landed on the bell and then on him. He wasn't sure whether she saw the animal or only its lack. There was a kind of winter seeing that only showed you the parts you have words for. She made her voice quiet like his grandmother did and said, come on, Mickey. Indoor now. MS. Henley closed the door with that extra push at the end that put weather into its right place. You make me older than I am, she said, not unkindly. What were you doing? I thought I heard, he stopped. The bell warned. I thought I heard a bell. Her eyes did a thing like smoke coming out of a chimney and going straight down. When you hear that, you stay in, she said. I know the rule. Do you know why it's a rule, or is it just a sound you obey? She twisted her headlamp off. She was an outsider who had learned the island's grammar fast and now wanted to parse it out loud. There was a program years ago, before I was born. They collared wolves with bells on the Russian side so soldiers would know when they were close to camps in the dark. The wolves learned that sound. Some followed it gladly. Some learned it to hold still when it rang so they sounded like snow. Then why do we stay inside? Because sound crosses. She said, because anything you say to one side can be heard by the other. Because bells call things. Some things are not mail or pizza. He thought of the bell asking him to wear it. What if the bell is here? She frowned and then, unhelpfully, laughed. Because the right laugh can be a sigh turned inside out to keep adults from missing their train. Then don't ring it. He slept poorly on a couch in the classroom with his parka over his face. He dreamed of the lead glinting, of a mouth under the ice opening and closing, of his grandmother's hand on his sleeve turning into something with fur that had never known rain. He woke to the unkind light of morning that isn't exactly morning, just a thinner part of night that people agreed to be up in. He went home under a sky that had decided to be pink for a few minutes like a gift that didn't fit any box. Anna met him at the door with silence enough to fill a wail. Then she took his face in her hands and looked a long time into the part of his eyes you cannot see yourself and said, "Are you hungry?" "Yes," he said, and it was the easiest truth available. He didn't tell her until evening. He washed the cup until it refused to get any cleaner. He dried it too slowly and then said, "I took a bell off a wolf." She kept stirring the pot with the patience of a person who had seen a winter do worse things to people than bells. "You took it off?" "Yes." "Is it here?" He pulled the bell out from under his sweater. He had threaded it onto a thong of leather from his snow machine mittens. It was warm from his skin. He offered it to her, expecting. He didn't know what he expected. Scolding, maybe. The story thickening with anger and cracking like new ice. She touched the brass with one finger, and it was a touch like she had given a sleeping baby. No, like she had told a sleeping baby she would pick it up and then not, because some things you leave sleeping. "It shouldn't be in the house," she said softly, "but it shouldn't be outside either." "What is it counting?" he asked. "Do you want a grandmother answer or a science one?" she asked. "Both," he said, because both was world-sized and he wanted the world to be big enough for his choices. Grandmother answer, it counts names, and bells call what you count. Science answer, it's an object that carries a pattern. It rings when your thoughts change shape. That means it can move things, people maybe, time sometimes. Time. Haven't you ever stood at the shore and looked at tomorrow? She asked and smiled, and it was a smile that forgave him for being 14. That night toward 3, when the village pretended to be asleep, the radio in the school woke without the help of a person again. The office wasn't locked. Not everything needed to be. It clicked and warmed and made a sound like a mouth before it speaks. It read a name in Russian, then another, and then Mickey's mother's in the soft, wrong vowels. Pilots swear the air remembers route numbers after noon. He left his house in socks and moved toward the sound as if pulled. The bell against his chest warmed, not in pulses but in a smooth, steady way like a strip of sunny floor in a cold room. MS. Henley was already there because teachers are the sort of people who consider themselves on call for bad thoughts. She had her headlamp off and her hands wrapped around a mug that had known better tea. He hovered in the doorway as if not being inside would keep him from having to say any words. "You heard it?" she asked, and he nodded. "We should write it down when it says names," she said. "We should do a thing with those, put them on paper and stop trusting the window to show us faces we know." "What are the names, people?" "Signals," she said, and he knew she meant both. She turned the volume down so the names didn't build a mountain in the room. "I checked the call sign. It's a weather relay on the other side. They send ship traffic and a list of surnames no one there can explain. Some say it's a memorial. Some say it's a test pattern. Some say a major lost his wife and never properly closed that tab in his head. The world never fights very hard to decide." "It said my mother's name," he said. She watched his mouth, not his eyes. "Sometimes the air says true things," she said. "Sometimes it says the name you were going to say anyway." "Is it stealing the future?" he asked. "Is this?" He gestured at the radio, the room, the line, borrowing the part with tomorrow and using it wrong. She rubbed her mug with thumbs red from cold. "No," she said finally. "I think the future is alone. We all just spend it badly sometimes." Before dawn, a four-wheeler engine snored to life in the cold, and a figure in a fur ruff too big to be useful pointed itself at the ice. It was Kunik, who liked to have something to chase in winter and would chase wind if wind looked back. He carried a rifle across his lap in that style that is careful and looks flippant if you don't know the difference. Mickey put on his boots and tied them this time and went. The wolf met them at the edge of the lead where black water breathed out white steam like a tired horse. It wasn't afraid of the machine or of the ways men make distance small. It stood as if greeting and lifted its head to show the strap empty. Kunik narrowed his eyes like a man trying to read a sign through falling snow. He lifted the rifle half a notch, then thought better. The world has a way of teaching some people how to lower guns gracefully. You put hands on that? He asked Mickey without looking away from the animal. Yes. Kunik grunted and oil smelled the bolt. Your grandmother says you were born mouth first, he said. Maybe bells want mouths. What does it say? Names, Mickey said. Ah, Kunik said and grimaced as if he had expected something more romantic. Everything is names. Animals wear theirs better than we do. People grind theirs down. The wolf took 2 steps back and turned its head in a way that included the draw of the current. It would like us to go away now, Mickey said, and was not sure whether he was speaking for the wolf or for everyone but him. Good, Mick said. I hate being invited to do things by animals. Makes me feel like a bad neighbor. He put the rifle back across his knees and thumbed the safety on so firm it was a report. He idled backward and let his machine do that crab thing, tires stepping sideways on ice. Mickey did the same, slowly. The bell slid against his chest like a thought choosing a different shape. He looked at the wolf without a pretend name for what it was and saw it look back. Thank you, he said in Inupiaq, because the language tastes different between your teeth when you're talking to an animal that is not pretending to be an animal. The wolf flicked an ear. The ear seemed to mean, that is the wrong thing to thank me for, or, it isn't finished yet, or, I have a different weather report than you. In late February, the first storm in 2 weeks scared the snow into sky and turned the strait into blown glass again. In the storm's short eye, the bell at his chest went hot and then not and then hot again. He went outside and listened, and there it was, the polite cough of brass and snow, except the bell he wore did not ring. The sound walked the ridge above the village like a person scouting a line. He followed up the switchback stairs that make deomed legs into strange machines. The church stood black against black. A windsock high on a pole took no one's advice. At the top, by the flag that insists the border, is a line you can draw across moving water. He found the wolf. It stood with its front paws on a drift that had become a thinks-it's-a-rock, its head turned toward Big Dion. Floodlights on the Russian island cast long, slow beams like lighthouse breath. Between the lights, a dark moved, a patrolling thing, maybe, or a man walking his shape. The wolf made a sound like a keening swallowed too late. It was almost a song and almost the sound of a harness leather stretching. The bell against his chest answered with a careful little thud, and he knew what this was, some of it. A calling and an answering. A name put into the world like a piece of meat held in a gloved hand so a dog can learn to take gentle. It turned its head to him and in his language said, "They're counting. Us. Anything that moves," it said. On still nights they count what does not move too. They like to get even numbers. Even numbers feel like fences. What do we do? He asked. We are odd, the wolf said, and took its paws off the hump and dropped its chest to the snow and sneezed. He laughed because a sneeze is a sneeze whatever mouth it comes from. And in that laugh he felt something loosen in the bell, something that had a too tight soldier's buckle feeling leave. Well, he started, then stopped, because you avoid choosing the wrong name at gates. Your mother, the wolf said. She does what names do. She travels in whoever says her. Sometimes it is the radio, and sometimes it is you, and sometimes it is your grandmother, and sometimes it is less polite things. She kept your name, he said, and let the unfairness of that live in the air for a second like a frost halo. Only because I lost it, the wolf said without offense. When people were stone and animals were people, we traded tools and borrowed things that made winter smaller. You think no one kept anything too long then? You think we had no thieves? We were you. You are us. The bell belongs to whoever needs to count the most that night. He touched the brass. It had cooled. He thought he knew what keeping it meant, and then he understood he didn't. Keeping meant responsibility doesn't leave you just because the door is closed and the bell is on a nail. He took the thong off his neck and held it halfway to the wolf, the way you hold a treat out to a dog you want to teach trust. The wolf cocked its head, then leaned forward and nudged the bell with a mouth that did not touch metal. The bell made a sound like an exhale. Wear it when you hear me and take it off when you hear her. The wolf said, do not wear it for anyone with a gun or a clipboard. Do not show it to anyone who collects anything. I'm going to mess this up, he said. Then winter will come again, the wolf said, almost comforting. It likes to bring you do-overs. You don't always like to recognize them. Spring broke up like a man who wants the argument and the reconciliation at once. The ice went from road to water to glass to nothing in a week, the way it can when the strait decides to show you how fast a place can change and still slice fish the next day. The bell against his chest was cooler then, fussy, like an old person in a hot room. He wore it less. Sometimes he hung it on the back of a chair while he rinsed the floor and found himself apologizing to it for the indignity. He waited for his mother and did not wait. He did the day tasks, salted shadows, fetched water, carried a box of food that had beaten weather only to be put in a freezer because that is an Alaskan joke. And he did the night work of thinking a person into a room, and then out of it again because the room can't hold that much presence without its corners going soft. He told the bell her name now and then, carefully, like a person saying grace before and after a meal. Early June, a fog unrolled off the water like someone had decided the village should be a movie set and no one had told the wind. In that fog, the radio in the school woke at 3:13 even though the sun hadn't had the decency to leave the sky. It read a single name in his mother's voice, even the little laugh she made when she mispronounced her own vowels to make fun of the way MS. Henley said them. Then it read a weather report in Russian. Tomorrow, land where sea should be. Wrong, MS. Henley said aloud to the empty office. Wrong on purpose, she said again and wrote it on the whiteboard like homework. And on a clear night not long after, Kunik looked up from mending a net and saw something moving on the far island's ridge. Not a man, not a soldier, not a vehicle. A pack paced and neat, and one large wolf among them whose head turned toward little Dionne as if borders were interesting but not important. He told Anna, who told no one, and that made it the kind of story that becomes truer over time. Mickey kept the bell where the wolf told him to keep it, over his heart when the night asked him to count, under his pillow when the day asked him to eat, in his pocket when people came to ask for it kind and reasonable and wrong. Men came by with notebooks, students with questions, one woman who worked for something with initials, all smiles, all patience, all wanting to touch the thing that counted names so their own would be counted by it. It's just a story, MS. Henley would say, suddenly on his side. Leave the boy his jewelry. And sometimes in late night, when fog walked like a polite burglar, a single ring would sound in the village and people would wake and listen, not to the bell but to their own thoughts changing shape, an apology, an argument they could choose not to have, a decision that would be there in the morning too. The bell doesn't fix anything, it just counts, but sometimes counting is what keeps a winter from breaking something it shouldn't. He didn't answer when kids asked if he had seen his mother. He didn't lie either. He said, "Sometimes I hear her," which was true and could mean enough different things to keep privacy fed. He said, "Sometimes I hear names in the radio, and sometimes I hear my own thinking." He said, "Sometimes the wolf runs on the other island, and it looks this way like it has a joke." On the first day the helipad went green, he went up to the ridge where the flag pretended to flutter, and the dates changed in the air between the islands before the paper ones caught up. He took the bell off and held it out and put it back on again. He had learned that you can both keep and give a thing if you stop trying to do it cleanly. He stood there until the skin on his face stung with the insult of summer air, and his eyes wanted tears without a reason. He wore the bell to bed that night because dreams are a place to count things you can't hold. He dreamed of his mother coming in from cutting fish and putting her cold hands on his neck and laughing when he yelped. He woke with the smooth side of the bed warm and the dent on the other side newly deepened in a way that meant someone your size had slept there. He didn't mention it. It is the kind of story you keep like a full fuel can in winter. Not on the shelf, not in the open, but where your hand can find it in the dark. Years from now, long after the bell had lost its shine to the polite insults of kitchen steam and salt spray, long after MS, Henley had moved to a place where the sky didn't make a circle you could wear like a hat, long after men with initials had stopped sending questions and started sending budgets, the radio in the school would still wake itself at 3:00 whatever when fog made the air thoughtful, read a single name in a voice someone needed to hear, then say a weather that was wrong in a way that felt right. Tomorrow, land where sea should be. And sometimes, when the fog took its time leaving, when the bell rang not at all and the wolves were just wolves, and the line between islands was just a line, you could stand at the shore and see, clearly, an animal made of winter running on the far island with no bell and a new breadth to its stride. And you could feel something in your chest, not let go exactly, but stretch in a way that reminded you of good leather. If you put your hand there over your heart, you'd find brass, heavy and wrong and yours, and you could count your breaths, one to say stay, one to say run, and one to say both. The bell never told him what to do. It just made a sound when he had already decided. That was its mercy. That was its trick. He grew older and kept making decisions, and the bell kept lightly, gently, telling him when the shape of those decisions had changed. Which is to say, it kept him honest. Which is to say, it kept his mother in the room when she needed to be and out of it when she needed to hunt. If you asked him what it was for when he was 60 and his knees told him the story of every stair, he'd say this without needing to check with anyone. It counts names. It keeps them from falling through. It rings for thoughts changing shape. It rings so you don't have to say everything out loud to make it real. And then he would turn his head toward Big Dioned, toward tomorrow, and squint as the light there turned gold a fraction sooner than on his side. And he'd smile in the exact way his grandmother had smiled the day she forgave him for slipping out. All those winters ago, when the bell coughed in snow and a rule had wanted to be tested. And that smile would be the kind that keeps a winter from breaking you, because you've learned how to listen to a small sound and not make it a larger one. The bell didn't stop ringing when the pack vanished into the Russian fog. Mickey slept with it against his chest and learned its tricks. It chimed for thoughts, not footsteps. It answered names, not calls. On the third night, it rang once at the edge of a dream, clear, metallic, and far, and the school radio, still unplugged, woke to a weather report that wasn't about weather at all. Tomorrow, Land where sea should be. Lines will move. Word like that skims over islands. It rode a VHF skiff to a ranger shack, then to a road crew shed, then to a survey office where a junior tech named Tala was packing a Trimble and a bundle of fiberglass stakes. She didn't hear wolf or bell. She heard the part about lines, and that was enough. The 141st Meridian had been behaving all winter like a zipper losing teeth. Monuments leaning, cut line heaving, coordinates burping as if the world had indigestion. On Little Dion, Mickey touched the bell and felt a faint answering ring from very far inland, as if something white and patient were tapping its enamel with a spoon. On the highway to the border cut, Tala felt the same ring hum through the rebar in the bed of her truck. 2 warnings, 1 sound. The animals had crossed. Now it was the line's turn. Story 5, the surveyor's white stake. I was hired to make the border behave. On paper, the 141st Meridian is a perfect thread. In the field, it's a scar you can walk. A mile-wide haircut called the cut line, shaved through spruce and alder so the United States and Canada can stare at each other across a stripe. The obelisks that punctuated every mile are concrete teeth, white pyramids with stamped brass caps and polite numbers facing both ways. USA on one side, Canada on the other. You're supposed to check that they are still upright, still where the treaties say they should be, still themselves. My name is Tala. I'm a junior survey tech, which in summer means I carry the rover and swat mosquitoes. In winter, like now, it means I carry the rover and swat silence. We'd had a warm spell that slid wrong into a hard freeze. The muskeg was stiff as candy glass. The seep lines nodded with ice. Our base station blinked faithful on a shoulder of rock that pretended to be permanent. The Trimble on my pole hummed through its list of satellite names like a child counting in another room. My partner, Toby, tugged his balaclava down and pointed to the first obelisk of the day. 2 centimeters lean since September, he said, tapping the data collector. Probably frost heave. Log it. We'll recompute. How's your coffee? Hot enough to lie to me, I said. I breathed into my mitts, counted 3 beats in, 3 out, a habit I kept from avalanche school and from nights when panic counted me first. We logged the milepost and moved. The cut line ran straight enough to feel like a dare. Sun knifed between black spruce. Snow squeaked under my boots in the register of dry styrofoam. Birds had the sense to be somewhere else. When wind pushed, it combed the young alders so their branches clicked together like racks of antlers learning to touch. The 4th obelisk had a bite mark, not the literal crescent of a tooth, more like a flake torn low on a face, as if something with patience had licked the concrete for years and finally learned where to pry. I knelt, set the rover bubble level by reflex, and traced the ragged patch with a glove. The concrete was smooth as enamel where the skin was gone. Kids, Toby said without interest. Sharp tool bored mind. There aren't any kids out here, I said. There's always a kid, he said and shouldered on. We found the 5th monument exactly where the coordinates promised. The 6th was 6 feet off. The 7th was missing. In its place, at exactly the right distance from 6 and 8, stood a stake that was not on any map. It was taller than the others by half a foot and wider by a degree you feel in your eyes before you can name it. White like fresh snow under noon sun. White like a dentist's light on a molar, white that thinks it's clean air. It looked poured, but there were no seams. It had no cap, no stamp, no number. It reflected the world without reflecting anything in particular. When I stepped close, gnats lifted in a glittering sheet and fell again without committing to flying. I scraped it with the edge of my key. The line I raised filled itself in while I watched. Toby chuckled and wrote a note that in government language meant we had seen something and would later pretend we had not. Someone's art project, he said, or frost sculpting. Take a photo for Becky if you must. I did. The camera argued with the shape, like it didn't want to do the math, and returned an image with a faint halo and a thumbprint smear where there shouldn't have been any lens flare. I stood, stepped back, and the ground thumped once under my boots. Not a tremor, a chew, a patient working motion transmitted through frozen peat, through my ankles into bone. I felt it behind my teeth. Did you feel? I started. Cold, he said, and kept walking. Our radios hissed. They hissed the way wind does when it needs a mouth. We keep them on a shared channel with the road crew and the ranger station. You learn voices. A new voice broke in, thin with altitude or age, a man unused to lungs. Careful along the old line. It said conversationally. The old line had teeth. I thumbed my PTT, identify. The voice laughed in a way a saw laughs when it finds green wood. Foreman, 1908, learned late. Cute, Toby said, as if we were in a bar and someone had told a joke that didn't deserve to land. He turned his radio off to save battery, checking the rover tilt as he went. I kept mine on. The white stake didn't cast a shadow until I looked at it expecting one, and then it cast my shape on the clean snow and kept it there after I stepped away. We finished the day both chilled and sweating, that familiar field-body contradiction. Back at the truck, the heater blessed us and the windows fogged in the pattern of my breath, which looked briefly like handwriting and then collapsed, embarrassed, into transparency. I put us on the radio to report out. Unit K2 back to road. I told dispatch. Day 1 complete. 1 missing obelisk, 1 unknown. Will file coordinates. Copy, Becky said. Her voice came from a warm room with a microwave in it. Storm tomorrow. Move fast if you're going to move. In the motel in Tok, the shower sputtered iron and pissed brown and then cleared. I wrote my notes longhand like my first mentor made me do. My pen hovered over the spot where I usually add a sketch. I drew a triangle for the unknown state. When I lifted my hand, the ink in the triangle ran and the triangle filled itself in, neat as a child coloring within a line. I dreamed about my father cleaning my teeth when I was 7. He wasn't a dentist, he was an electrician who hated mouths. He held that terrible bright tool the hygienist used. Count, he said to calm me. Can you be helpful for once? When I woke at 2:13 a.m., hotel HVAC roaring like a plane, my jaw ached and the skin over my shins felt thin, like I had scabbed there while sleeping. We returned the next morning with sun bulling the sky and the wind deciding not to be our friend. I wanted to pass the white stake fast, like a dog that pretends the vacuum isn't real. But the rover chirped a correction east by an arrogance you never hear out of a unit that has to pretend the world isn't moving. We're off, I said. Sat geometry is trash, Toby said. Ignore the burp. At the sight, the stake looked fresher. I have no other word. The snow at its base lay untroubled. The cement at 8 had spalled a little more. Its cap had a new nick. At the old missing 7, at the white stake, the gnats rose when my shadow crossed and settled exactly back into their cradle. Behind me, a snowshoe hare rattled the brush. I turned. The hare froze into hare statue the way they do, trusting you to be fooled by the least lie available. The ground gave a small, fond thump. The hare bolted wrong, not away but toward the stake. It stopped a yard from the base and tipped onto its side with the lazy roll of something that only just now comprehends that running and living are not the same verb. Its whiskers twitched, then stilled. Snow at its mouth melted and then wasn't snow at all. The white stake leaned a fraction of a degree, then stood polite again. "Don't set a replacement," the radio voice said. "It eats what replaces it." I swallowed air until my throat learned, then keyed. "Who are you? Who's playing on this channel?" "Foreman," the voice said. "Dominion crew. We brought brass and flour, and the flour went first." "What did you do?" I asked before I could decide not to. "Wrong things," the voice said. "We decided Earth was softer than men. It corrected our error." Toby waved me along. He had the rebar, a 4-foot steel pin standard, the closest thing to a spear a survey tech gets. "Let's mark a back site," he said. "One clean offset. Call it temporary." The word temporary is a prayer dangerous men say before they sin. "Don't," I started. But he had the hammer up, one smart swing to set, one more to hold. He smiled under the wool like a kid making noise because noise means courage. On the third hit, the ground made a sound like a jaw closing. The rebar went down 2 inches like it had been pulled. Toby's arms shot straight. He held the rebar like a wishbone refusing to break. "Toby," I said. "It's hung up," he grunted, breath pluming. The stake leaned toward him by a hair, like a man leaning over a neighbor's fence to hear. Frost along its face caught light in a way frost doesn't. I grabbed the pin to add counter. It thrummed like a tuning fork. The ground thumped, a gentler chew, happy as a dog with a bone. My hand shook in concert with a rhythm I didn't recognize as mine. The rebar slid another inch. I got my boot up against the base and put my back into pulling the way you do when you don't want to confess that you can't actually fix a thing. "Let go," the radio voice said in my ear almost kindly. "Let it take what you promised it." "I didn't promise," I said. "You did when you measured," voice said. "You promised to be the size of what you say you are. It takes that from anything proud." I swore, some word my mother said only in the pantry, and let go. My palms released the steel, and in that same breath the bar went down in a single, satisfied gulp to the head. The white stake stood straighter as if braced by a new root. Toby laughed once, the kind of laugh you let out to cover the sound of fear. I wanted to punch him for it. Then he needed his gloves, looking as though he had pins and needles shooting up both arms. "We'll note it," he said, voice steady with force. "We'll flag the site. No one should dig here." He walked off up the line without me. The snow squeaked like it wanted to be polite. When I caught up, he was at 9, kneeling to brush a brass cap clean, breath hard. "I'm going to make some calls tonight," he said. "Archivist at Whitehorse might know why the old heads put one here. Could be a field fix. Could be somebody poured a monument where a monument didn't belong and the treaty boys looked the other way." "There's no brass," I said. "No stamp." "Maybe they were out," he said. The wind tugged his hood and showed me a patch of hair the size of a silver dollar he'd probably never seen, scalp white as paper. I thought about saying something and then imagined the shape of the conversation that followed and did not. At the motel, the shower was colder, the towel thinner. I dreamed the white stake had gums. In the dream, I slipped on my back at its base like I'd done on wet logs as a kid, breath gone. The sky a loud white, and the stake leaned, and my jaw buzzed. I woke chewing the inside of my cheek and spat blood into the sink, then felt ashamed for bleeding and ashamed for being ashamed. In the morning, the weather changed its mind like a liar. A delta of frost cracking opened along the cut line, not a rift so much as a loose seam. We worked with our heads up and our feet unconfident. The radios kept their jokes to themselves. When we came within sight of 7 again, the hair was gone. In its place lay a moose jaw, cleaned and polished as if for a museum, battered on one side in a way that told a story I didn't want to read. The teeth were worn to ovals, smooth as pew oak. The jaw lay with the row of teeth pointing toward the white steak like a prayer rug. I texted a photo to a ranger I liked. He wrote back, wolves or kids, and a winking emoji because he knew I hated them and did not know that this time I hated him for using one. Toby wanted to put a pin 20 feet out this time, then set a stake in the snow to keep us honest for sighting. I wanted to leave. We did neither. We walked 50 yards past and sat on our heels with our backs to a stump that had the courtesy to be dead. I drank coffee gone to battery acid. The wind was the kind of steady that can turn your face into chalk if you let it. "You hear that?" Toby said. It was a small rhythmic noise, subaudible like pumice rubbed with a thumb. It came from under the cut line. If you didn't listen on purpose, you could pretend it was your own heart or the hiss of blood in ear cartilage taught too many winters to hold heat. When I stood, it stopped. When I sat, it returned. "Chewing," I said. "Frost," he said. I didn't say it out loud. That the steak hadn't always been there, that the map isn't the land. But the thought must have had weight because the radio cracked and the foreman's voice dropped as if to confide. We tried to move the white thing with block and tackle. We greased it. We swore at it. We prayed at it. It wouldn't go. The night after we marked a new position as if we'd succeeded, it came to the new position and stood in the hole we dug for it. We decided as a unit, home. How do I keep it from eating everything I set? I asked, so softly I might not have keyed the mic. "Don't set," he said. "Count and lie in the right direction." I slept a short, violent sleep. In the morning, Toby had a plan that sounded like courage if you didn't examine it. "We'll run past 7, he said. "We'll get the line true with 6 and 8 using a long baseline and a set of backsides. We'll post-process the hell out of the burps. We'll put a note in the deliverable that says, essentially, we forgive this error because the world is rude." "What about the thing?" I said. "What thing?" he said, and the hairless circle above his ear looked bigger. We moved. The sky went the color of old aluminum. My cheeks cracked one after the other like fresh paint. I was thinking about warm places in the way you think about them on purpose just to be mean to yourself when the world got quiet in that particular way that means a big thing is about to happen. The ground thumped. The white steak leaned exactly the amount a nod is yes. "You going to take my pole?" I said aloud, and then wished I hadn't made the thought into air. Something answered that wasn't the radio. It was a weight shift, a new pressure on the balls of my feet, a very small adjustment in the shape of the world I could feel in shin bone. You could call it an answer if you were generous. Toby put his head down and walked with the pace of a man who will not permit the world its opinion. In that same moment, his boot broke through crust into water. He swore and drew his foot out, and I took one step toward him because that's what you do. Reach without thinking. And my left leg went thigh deep into a slot that had not been there a breath earlier. Cold to the groin is a lesson you can teach a body only once. There is pre and there is after. I hollered without words. My hands went to the pole not to catch myself, but to keep it out of the hole, which tells you more about me than I like. Toby grabbed my pack strap and got his heels dug in. The ground thumped in a rhythm too fast for chewing. I thought of the jaw laid like a compass. I thought of the little marks in the old concrete. I thought of the word lie the way the foreman had said it, not as sin, but as instrument. "I'm going to give you something," I said to the steak because I had run out of good ideas. "You can have the thing you want most and leave the rest of it alone. You shouldn't bargain with land. It holds grudges and layers. But when you are half a person and your blood is deciding whether it wants to live indoors anymore, you do arithmetic you might later call foolish." I reached into the pocket that held the data collector. I pulled it out. My thumb danced menus it had learned like a song. I scrolled to the base station correction settings and watched my breath stripe the screen and then vanish. I changed the datum for this mile. I introduced a correction big enough to make any supervisor call me into an office and make me sit in a chair while they arranged their face for words they couldn't say without ruining both our weeks. I lied a kilometer, then 2, then more. I made the map misremember itself where the white steak was. The ground went still as if a mouth had been fed. Toby yanked me out of the hole with the efficiency of a man who wants to be somewhere else. The water in my boot made a noise like breaking a small cigar. I lay on my back and coughed air I didn't need through laughter I didn't mean. The rover beeped twice and settled into believing a graph it knew was wrong. "You good?" he asked, nailing, then standing because my panic sloshed off me and landed in him. "Define," I said. My thighs burned. My shin had a line of purple across it that would show later. My stomach hurt like I'd done sit-ups to impress a person who didn't care. "We're done," he said with professional briskness, pretending my eyes weren't wet. "We'll clean it in post. We'll write the note." "Write it well," I said, trying to keep my teeth from clicking. We left the line early. I pretended it was for safety. In the truck, I put my hands on the heater vents and pretended a lot of other things too. The radios were polite. The motel shower promised more than it delivered, and the towel gave up after the hips. When I lay down to sleep, the bed tilted very slightly to the right. I put my hand on the wall to steady myself and swore because it was the wrong wall. I had put my bed on the other side of the room for a year and could not have been wrong. But there I was, and there it was, and the roar of the heater did not allow arguments. In the morning, the hair above Toby's ear was a neat circle the size of a $50. I could see it even with the balaclava and the hood. I did not say a word. He did not mention that my thumb trembled when I held the data collector for the first minute and then steadied of its own accord. We did our job. We logged monuments that did not love us. We pretended satellite geometry was a friend in a month when it wasn't. When we passed 7, the white steak gleamed the way a bleached bone in desert novels gleams to honor the author's work. It did not lean. The ground did not chew. The moose jaw lay where it had, teeth a steady song. We finished, and I wrote the clean report in the language that keeps agencies married to their budgets. Everything nominal, recommended minor grips, no anomalies observed requiring action. In the upload, I slipped the lie without explanation. I told myself I would fix it later. Then I told myself I had already fixed it in the only way it would permit. We drove out. The cut line receded in the mirror not because I looked, but because lines recede when you leave them. The base station blinked smaller and smaller until a tree ate it. The truck heater did its noble job and my wet boot warmed and stank, and I didn't care. When we passed the place where the cut crosses the big river, a raven followed us for 3 miles, lazy as a kite. Back at the shop, the chief glanced at our deliverable and said, "Look at you, on time." He stamped the cover and never once asked a question I didn't want to answer. I went home and ate in the place's cold teaches. I slept with my hand under the pillow like I had at 12, as if I had a knife there, as if I might be the sort of person who could use one. In spring, long after we had gone, hikers called the ranger about a new monument that shone like polished sugar and seemed to move with them, appearing at different distances depending on how many steps they'd counted. Photos came in grainy and reluctant. A hunter found a moose jaw at 9, chewed smooth and set like an offering. The ranger sent me a picture and typed, "wolves or kids," with no emoji this time. I didn't respond. My rebar lives in the bed of my truck now. I bought another with my own money and told procurement I'd lost the first, and they rolled their eyes and marked a column and said something about accountability. When I drive on washboard at night, the rebar taps the bed wall in a steady rhythm that answers my tires. 2 beats, pause, 2 beats, as if practicing the names of the things we saw. Sometimes, when I am half asleep and my hands have forgotten where to put themselves, I reach for north and grab something else. I stand in a room and don't know which wall should have the bed. I open a cabinet that has always held coffee and fine sugar, then think, maybe it always did. On a map, the line I changed lies clean and straight, admitting nothing. On the ground, in the right light, the white stake shows itself. In certain weathers, if you stand with your boot soles square and your breath steady, you can feel the earth make a small, satisfied sound as if working a mouthful. If you don't name it, it is easier to walk away. On a clear day in July, I drove out not to the cut, but to the library in Fairbanks. I read until my eyes sanded themselves. There is no foreman on paper in 1908 who wrote what I heard. There is a note in a margin where a hand is shaken. Do not set in ivory. There is a photograph of a picnic to celebrate the laying of so many obelisks per week. The men look pleased and sunburned. The women look like they knew something the men would learn or wouldn't. In that same folder, a child's drawing of triangles with faces, a milk tooth taped below like a charm. I put the folder back. I sat in the car with the windows down and the rebar tapping in the bed. I counted my breath 3 in, 3 out, not because I was afraid, but because counting is a way of admitting you are small and you have chosen to love a thing that will eat you if it wishes. We make lines because we are proud. The land corrects us. My job is to measure the difference between the two and write it down as if I were not one of the things being measured. On some mornings, I believe I am getting away with it. On others, I can hear the sound of something chewing under my boots, and in that rhythm, I think I can make out my name.